The day my own people left me to die, they were polite about it. That's the part that still gets me. Nobody spat on me, nobody drew a knife. They just waited until I was 3 floors deep in a dead shopping mall, picking the last cans out of a looted grocery, and then they rolled the steel shutter down behind me and drove off. I heard the truck start. I got to the shutter in time to put my fingers through the grate and watch my own squad pull out of the lot, men who'd eaten at my father's table, and not one of them looked back. The captain glanced my way, once. He had the decency to look ashamed, which changes exactly nothing, and then they were gone, and I was alone 3 floors down in a building full of the kind of neighbors who eat you. Then the universe told a joke, and it has a mean sense of humor. My squad didn't make it home either. Something fast and hungry caught them in the parking structure and turned the whole tidy little murder into a waste of gasoline. They left me to die, and died instead, and the useless air they'd sealed in the tomb was, at that exact moment, the only one of the group still breathing. Which is a good time to tell you who I was, so the shutter makes sense. I'm the son of the man who built that base. 3 years ago, the dead stood up and the world ended, and out of the wreckage my father raised a place called Dalongshan. Walls, a few thousand survivors, a reason to get up in the morning. He was a good man and a strong one. Then he died on a hunt, and before his chair was cold, a man named Wang Wei had slid into it. And me? I was the problem that came with the chair. Because this apocalypse had started handing out superpowers, awakened we called them, people who could throw fire or move like smoke, and I hadn't gotten one. I was the chief's ordinary son. An heir with a claim and no power is just a loose thread, and Wang Wei was the tidy sort. He didn't kill me in the square. He sent me on a supply run with men who had quiet orders and a shutter. So there I was. No, I'm not going to start it that way. Everybody starts it that way. Let me tell you how it actually went. I spent 2 days in a stockroom behind the grocery, in the dark, learning things about myself. That hunger stops being in your stomach after a while and moves up behind your eyes. That the dead don't sleep, so you don't either. They just drag themselves along the far side of the wall, a wet, endless shuffle, close enough that I could have knocked a hello. I found 3 exits in those 2 days. One was the shutter, welded shut by its own weight. One was a stairwell with a jammed door and a moan behind it. The third was a ventilation gap I could get an arm through, and nothing else. The son of the man who ended 1,000 people's nightmares was going to end in a storeroom that smelled of spoiled milk, and the joke of that was almost enough to keep me warm. On the 3rd day, the hunger got louder than the fear, which is how you know the fear was doing its job right up until then, and I crept out to find something to eat. I cornered a single corpse by the electronics counter, slow, half-rotted, one of the old kind, and I raised the only weapon I had, which was a laptop. Sit with the dignity of that. The heir to Dalongshan, making his last stand against the end of the world with a mid-range notebook computer he'd grabbed off a shelf because it had a satisfying weight to it. I'd torn my hand open on that shelf, and my blood was smeared all over the thing, and when I brought it down on the zombie's skull with everything 2 starving days had left me, the laptop did not crack. It vanished. Gone. Out of my hands, mid-swing, and a hole opened in the middle of my palm, a little spinning vortex drinking the light, and before I could be properly afraid of it, it drank me too. That's the origin, not a training montage. A betrayed nobody at the bottom of everything, starving in the dark, swinging a computer at a corpse. Rock Bottom has a basement, and I fell through the trapdoor into the strangest gift I've ever heard of. Here's the gift, because you'll need to understand it to enjoy the rest. My blood turns my palm into a computer. A real one. A screen under the skin. Drives. Storage. The works. Touch a living thing and hold on, and I can copy it, its powers written into its blood, the skills it's drilled into its hands, the things it knows, even the things it remembers, each onto its own drive inside me, a C drive for genes, a D drive for skills. Later, I'd unlock an E drive for pure knowledge and an F drive for memories, but that first day all I had was C, and a body too weak to use it. And here's the part that turns a curse into a fortune. Whatever I copy in, I can paste back out, into someone else. A man's magic, a monster's blood, a master's whole lifetime of skill, handed to a friend like passing a flash drive across a table. And before you go for the obvious exploit, the why not copy infinity and be a god by lunchtime, it doesn't work like that, which is the only reason there's a story. The genes I copy sit on my own lifespan like tenants, cram the drive full, and the rent comes due early, and I die young. I have to touch the thing and hold on, for real, for minutes sometimes, and a lot of things worth copying will happily kill you during the handshake, and I don't get to stay anywhere. Every world I land in, a pattern crawls across my palm like frost on a window. Slow, over about a month, and when it finishes, the vortex comes back and rips me to the next world whether I've packed or not, and it always dumps me back home first. Home being the dead mall, the apocalypse. the base with my father's chair in it, and Wang Wei's backside sitting in the chair. So, not a god by lunchtime, a thief on a schedule, robbing the multiverse one world at a time, getting strong the slow, patient, unfair way, the whole time carrying one very specific plan for the man who'd tried to have me erased. But a plan needs power, and the first world the Vortex chose for me was generous. It dropped me into a bar fight, standing next to a very angry man who could kill you with the loose change in your own pocket. His name was Kurt. You might know him by the name he grew into, Steelhand. When I fell out of the ceiling of that world, I landed on a barroom floor in the middle of the worst thing that could happen to 3 armed men, which was Kurt being upset with them. A dagger was crossing the room on its own. A man's own pistol was folding shut around his hand like a fist made of his own gun. I had about a second to appreciate the artistry before one of the panicking men squeezed off a wild shot and it went straight through my arm, because that is my luck exactly. I fall out of the sky and land directly inside other people's climaxes. Kurt caught the next bullet in the air a foot from my eye, held it there spinning, while he finished his business with the 3 men. I'll spare you, it was thorough. And then he looked at the bleeding stranger who dropped into his revenge scene, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, he decided to keep me. He fixed my arm in a hotel room that night, dug the bullet out with a pair of tweezers he steered without touching, which is a deeply unsettling way to receive medical care, and asked me exactly 2 questions. "Who sent you?" he said. Not a question, the way he said it. "Nobody sends me anywhere," I told him, which was the truest thing I'd say to him all month. "I go where I'm thrown." He didn't like that answer, but he didn't have a better theory, and a man made entirely of rage still likes an audience, so he let me stay and bleed on his floor. And while he worked, I cut my good palm on the bed frame and got my first real look at what the dead mall had given me. The screen lit up under my skin, and there, glowing on a drive with a label as plain as a price, tag, was his gene. The power to command metal and magnetism, to own every blade and bullet and locked steel shutter in creation. The exact power a man who'd just been sealed behind a shutter to die would want more than food, more than air, more than almost anything. There was one small problem, which was that copying it took sustained contact, a solid stretch of skin on skin, like holding a plug in a socket, and Kurt was a paranoid killer who did not hold hands. So I invented a con I would run in one form or another for the next 5 years, across worlds that hadn't been imagined yet. "Give me your hand," I said. He looked at me like I'd asked him to dance. "I read palms," I said. "Where I come from, it's a discipline. The sky marks certain men, and I can read the marks. You're marked, Kurt. You've been marked since you were a boy." I let that sit. Since the coin. Every muscle in his face stopped moving. And I took his hand, nice and slow, nice and reverent, the way you'd handle something holy, and while 30 gigabytes of the most feared power in mutant history quietly crawled up my arm, I read him his life. Except I wasn't guessing. "Where I'm from, Kurt, you're a movie." I knew about the coin his mother died over. I knew the shape of the wound and the name of the man who'd made it. "A man in a fine office," I said softly, watching the copy bar fill. "He made you bend the coin with your mind, and when you couldn't, he took the one thing you couldn't get back to teach you what you were. Alistair Cross." Kurt's hand went rigid in mine. "He's still alive, and you already knew that. What you didn't know is that the sky means you to find him. Anyone could learn my history," he managed. "Could they learn your future?" I said, and told him about the telepath he hadn't met yet, the bald man who'd build a family and offer him a brother, and how he'd hate the way it was offered and go anyway. Told him things that hadn't happened. Watched a killer decide with his whole heart that he'd found a genuine prophet when what he'd actually found was a guy who'd seen the film. That was the method, and it is astonishing how holy a man will treat you when you narrate the ending of a story he thinks he's living for the first time. The palm reading was never magic. It was just my excuse to hold on long enough to steal, and the prophecy was just me quoting the plot. The telepath's name was Arthur Finch. He lived in a mansion the size of a small country, and he was, God help me, the nicest person I met in any world I ever robbed. We took a taxi there, Steelhand and a fake prophet sharing a cab, the start of every bad joke, and inside I found the whole picture assembling itself the way I remembered. A blue-skinned young woman named Willow who could wear any face, a sharp CIA agent named Fiona, a scared brilliant boy who'd grow fur and fangs by the 3rd act, and a plot, the tidy kind that ends the world. Cross meant to shove the Americans and the Soviets into pointing every missile they owned at each other, then stand in the fallout as the only thing left. Kurt had exactly one thing he wanted out of the whole affair, which was Cross's death, so Kurt stayed, which meant I stayed, which meant I got to sit in the corner with a shopping list while a superhero team was assembled from raw teenagers, and it really was raw teenagers. Arthur had a machine that let him reach across the whole country with his mind and find every young mutant hiding in an attic or a circus or a strip club, and he brought them in one by one. A boy who screamed loud enough to fly, a boy who threw rings of raw force, a winged girl, a fellow who could adapt to survive anything, the brilliant blue-footed doctor, children, most of them, terrified of the one thing that made them special, and I watched a bald man in a wheelchair spend his patience teaching each of them that the thing they hated about themselves was the thing that would save their lives. I'd never seen anyone do that before. Where I'm from, the strong eat the weak and call it Tuesday. Here was a man gathering up the frightened and making them into something, asking nothing, and I sat in the corner of it copying techniques and taking notes and feeling, underneath the larceny, something I didn't have a word for yet. I'd learned the word 2 worlds later, watching a lonely swordsman die glad I'd come. The word was friend, and Arthur was the first person in any world to teach me it wasn't a weakness. They handed out code names. When they got to me, they wanted prophet, and I said no. I picked Chakravartin, a word from another world entirely, meaning a kind of spinning, copying eye, because it was a private joke, that being exactly what I was. They thought it sounded mystical. It was a diagnosis. Arthur wanted to read my mind, of course, kindly, gently, the way he did everything, one hand drifting toward his temple. May I? He said. It would help me understand your gift. No, I said, fast enough that it startled both of us. Because I'd already worked out the thing that would nearly kill me later. There are truths a mind isn't built to survive, and the top of that list is the knowledge that this, the mansion, the missiles, the frightened kids, is a story someone already finished and printed on a disc. You do not let a telepath see that, not if you like the telepath. So I told him the smaller secret instead. The copying. Showed him the screen in my palm, and being the best mind of his world, he understood it in 4 minutes and told me something that has kept me alive ever since. He tested my copy drive against an old groundskeeper, 83 years old, and read off the man's own nearly full storage. It's your life, Arthur said quietly. This capacity, it isn't free. Every gift you take out of your own years. Then he drilled me like a coach, focus and repetition and 100 small cruelties, until the 2 kilograms of metal I could nudge became 10, became 50, became a hand instead of a party trick. I owe the whole foundation of my strength to a man who asked for nothing back. Hold that thought. It matters at the end. Then Kurt, being Kurt, decided he was done waiting and went to kill Cross by himself, and the whole team scrambled after him onto the open sea. It turned into the kind of thing you'd pay to watch. Kurt hauling an entire submarine bodily up out of the water by main force, the sea sheeting off it in the sun, the single most magnificent thing I'd seen a person do up to that point in my life. And Cross slipping the whole trap anyway, gone in a puff of red smoke on the arm of a teleporting devil named Malachi, one breath before Kurt's grand gesture could land. What we got out of that day was a target on our backs, because Cross's people had felt me out there, the man who knew the future, and a villain who wants to script the apocalypse cannot allow someone to walk around with the ending in his pocket. So Cross came for us, at night, in the mansion. Malachi wore a helmet the Russians had built to keep telepaths out of his skull, which meant Arthur went suddenly deaf and blind to the one enemy in the house. It went the way these things go when you're outmatched in the dark. Malachi blinked Kurt clean out of the fight, into a house with plastic walls and non-metal guns and men whose entire job was to kill a man who needs metal. Arthur dropped under a blow he never saw. Missiles locked onto the mansion from over the horizon, and then it was very quiet, and I was on my knees on Arthur Finch's nice floor with the rest of the captured children. And Alistair Cross walked in among us, calm as a landlord. Which one of you, he said pleasantly, is Zhang Jing? Here's what saved us, and it's still my favorite thing that ever happened to me across every world I've seen. Cross didn't want me dead. He wanted me useful. A prophet is worth more talking than bleeding. So he crouched to my eye level and made his pitch, smooth as oil, about the new world and the right side of it. And to check whether my yes would be honest, he did the one thing my whole con had no defense against. He turned to the diamond woman beside him. Chloe, he said, see if he means it. The White Queen walked into my head to read the truth, and she found it. She found all of it. I felt her go in, expecting a liar's surface thoughts, and instead she hit the thing underneath, the thing I keep in the deepest room, and I did the only counterattack I had. I stopped holding the door shut, and I let her look. She found that her world had a title card, that her life was a story that a bored audience in another universe had already watched to the end, that her boss loses, that the beautiful, terrible man she'd bet everything on was a supporting character in a film for children, and she was a smaller one, and every choice she had ever agonized over in the dark had been written by a stranger and pressed onto a disc before she drew a breath. She got about 4 seconds in. Then she made a sound I have never heard a human being make before or since. Not a scream exactly, something underneath the scream, and she wrenched out of my mind and out of her chair, both hands pressed to her diamond skull like she was trying to hold the pieces in, and she ran. Out of the room, out of the house, out of the plot entirely, and as far as I have ever been able to learn, she never got the pieces back in the right order. I broke the most powerful telepath in the room by being honest with her exactly once. That's the day I learned the most dangerous thing I carry isn't the magnetism or the swords, it's what I know. After that, the night turned. Arthur came around. The kids remembered they had powers. When Malachi blinked back in to finish us, I had a length of steel cable already waiting in the air, and I put it through him while I gripped his wrist so he couldn't teleport off the end of it. A copied power, used by a man from an apocalypse, plays for keeps. And Kurt came walking back out of the plastic house he was supposed to die in, soaked red, having wrapped a steel cable around his own body and let his ambushers empty their guns into him just long enough to get in reach, and then made them regret every round. And I made sure he got the ending the movie promised him. Cross was down and caught, and Arthur held Cross's body frozen from the inside with his mind, and I stepped back and let Kurt do it. A coin, one of his mother's, pushed slow through Alistair Cross's skull, while Arthur screamed in both their heads at the pain of it. The single most iconic death in the whole story. I could have stopped it. I steered it there instead, because a real revenge, paid in full by the man who earned it, is the one thing on this earth I will always help a person collect. I understood the appetite. I had one of my own, waiting at home in an apocalypse 3 years deep and counting. It fell apart after, the way it was always going to. The CIA wanted Cross's body and the one surviving villain for their labs. Kurt said no. Someone fired, and Kurt turned a dozen men's bullets back into them without blinking, and any hope of humans and mutants sharing a future died right there on that beach. He put on Cross's helmet, the one that keeps even Arthur out, and became the other thing, the harder thing. He held a hand out to me over the bodies. "Come with me," he said. "You of all people know how this ends for them." I almost did. There's a lot of me built like him. But there was a man in a wheelchair behind me who trained me and warned me and never once tried to force my head open, and where I'm from, a debt like that is the only law left. So I stayed. And a week later, playing chess with Arthur on a quiet afternoon, my palm went hot and the pattern finished its slow crawl and shattered into the vortex, and I left that world mid-move, one turn from a checkmate I'll never get to make. I took the power to command every scrap of metal in creation, and I did not yet know it would one day let me juggle a squad of alien war gods like a child stepping on his own action figures. But that was several worlds off. First, the vortex threw me somewhere I did not expect at all, straight back home. The vortex has one reliable cruelty. It always drops you back where you started. So after a month of mansions and submarines and the death of Alistair Cross, I landed on my hands and knees in the exact same looted electronics store, in the exact same dead mall, with the exact same corpse I'd been about to brain shuffling around somewhere in the dark, except now I could feel every screw and shelf bracket and dropped coin in the building like fingers on my own skin. I stood up in the ruins of my lowest moment and pulled every loose sliver of steel in that store into a slow orbit around me, a little galaxy of scrap, and thought, all right, let's go home and see about that chair. I did spend a moment regretting I hadn't found a way to copy the red teleporter. A man who can blink across a room would have solved a lot of my later afternoons. You learn to grieve the powers you let get away. But magnetism, in a world made of guns and rebar and locked doors, magnetism was a cheat code, and I hadn't even reached the good part yet. The good part, that day, arrived as 3 strangers who dropped in through a skylight and killed the fast zombie that had eaten my squad like it was a chore on the way to lunch. They were from Hero City, a bigger base, hundreds of miles off, the kind of place that still had working technology and manners. Their captain was a woman named Lynn Ruoxi, who fought with the spear and a skill that let her simply block anything, a wall you could not get past. She had a taciturn man who threw fire and a big lecherous one who carried a machine gun and opinions. They had a little device too, a crystal detector that measured how strong an awakened was, and they scanned me with it the way you'd check a stray for a chip. Here's the whole ranking system, because you'll want it for later, and I'll only say it once. Single digits, you're a rookie. Tens, you're a veteran. Hundreds, you're a monster who ends arguments by walking into the room. The needle on their little box, when they pointed it at me, twitched up to 5. 5, a rookie's rookie. My father, before Wang Wei's chair got warm, had died somewhere north of 300. And I stood there at 5, freshly returned from breaking the most powerful telepath in another universe, and had the good sense to smile and say thank you and let them sign me on as a reserve. Never show the whole hand, especially at 5. They took me to Dalongshan, my home. I hadn't seen the walls since the morning my own squad drove me off to die behind them, and now I was walking back in as a nobody attached to a foreign rescue crew, which is its own particular flavor of coming home. And there, across the yard, giving orders in my father's voice's place, I saw him, Wang Wei, a big man with a body that had awakened into literal steel, 300 and change on the detector, comfortable in a life he'd built on a poisoned hunt and a rolled-down shutter. He didn't know me. 3 starving years in a mall had changed my face enough, but Lin Ruoxi's big gunman spat on the ground at the sight of him, and I learned in that moment that Wang Wei had made enemies of the Hero City crew too, over some slight I filed away for later. Good, I thought. A man is known by who spits when he walks by. I wasn't ready for him. 5 is not a number you settle scores with. So I went out to the forest with Lin Ruoxi's crew to hunt beasts and grind myself up, and that is where I nearly died the ordinary way, and where Lin Ruoxi bought my life with her own arm. Because the apocalypse doesn't only make dead people stand up. It makes the animals wrong too. Bigger, faster, meaner, crystal counts that shame most men. What came for us in that forest was a bear the size of a delivery truck, 90 plus on the detector, a thing that outclassed everyone in our little party by an order of magnitude. It swung a paw at me that would have folded me into the mulch. And Lin Ruoxi, who barely knew me, who had every reason to save herself, stepped in front of a stranger and caught that blow on her block, and it held, and the recoil broke her arm. We ran. We hid in a cave with her arm hanging wrong, the bear snuffling the trees somewhere behind us, and while I stitched her up with a needle and thread and a lot of apologizing, 2 things happened. My own crystal count, ground up by a month of terror and effort, ticked over past 10, into the veteran band, and something inside my palm unlocked with an almost audible click. The D drive, skills, not just the powers a person is born with anymore, but the things they've trained into their hands. And I was holding the hand of a woman whose signature skill was the one that had just saved my life, so I copied it. Block. 3 gigabytes off Lin Ruoxi's wrist while I pretended to check her pulse. It felt like a low thing to do to someone who'd just broken her arm for me, and I'd spend the next few years quietly paying that debt back with interest, though neither of us knew it yet. Then the bear found the cave, and I led it away from her on legs. I magnetically hurried along, and right at the edge of losing that foot race, the pattern on my palm finished, and the vortex opened, and I fell out of the apocalypse again, this time with a shield I'd stolen from the first person in 3 years who treated me like I was worth saving. The vortex dropped me onto a misty mountain path in a world of sword saints and poison cults, and I met the one person in all my travels I would call a friend before I'd call him a mark. I still keep his red dress folded in my storage to this day. Let me tell you about him, because his is the one story out of all of these where I didn't win. I just lost slower than everyone else. It started, like most of my worlds, with someone attacking me on arrival. 2 men in dark robes came down the path swinging, and I flicked a short knife off a dead man's belt into a curve no thrown knife should make. Magnetism, steering steel around corners, and one of them dropped. The other, a jumpy young disciple named Chen Kai, watched a knife turn a corner in the air to find his friend's throat, and decided on the spot that I was a reclusive mountain master far too dangerous to fight and far too useful not to befriend. We swore brotherhood before nightfall. I've made worse friends slower. Chen Kai belonged to the Sun Moon Holy Cult, the demon sect, the rest of that world called it, the way you'd name a wasp nest in the kitchen. It was the most feared organization on the mountain, and I wanted in, because the strongest human being alive sat at the top of it. So I walked up to the cult's fortress and applied for a job, and when they asked what I could do, I said hidden weapons, and then I showed them a thing no master in that world could match. I threw 6 needles at the empty air, not at anyone, at nothing, at the ceiling, at the wrong walls. And I let magnetism ricochet all 6 off angles that didn't exist, around pillars and under a table, and put every one of them into the soft, unguarded hidden spots of a mountainous hall master across the room, behind his chair, beneath his arm, a hair from his spine. The bear of the 100 Ancients felt a needle stop against his own backbone from an impossible direction and hired me as his assistant before I'd finished bowing. They handed me a manual of internal energy too, and taught me my first real limit as a thief. I couldn't copy it. It wasn't a gene in the blood or a skill in the hands. It was a slow-grown thing, cultivated breath by breath over years, and my drives had no folder for it. If I wanted it, I had to sit and earn it like everyone else. So I did. A wisp at a time, the only honest cultivation I ever put in, and it's the reason all my later powers had a spine to stand on. But that came slow, and the story didn't wait, because then I met Peerless Cloud. That was his name, and it was not an exaggeration. He sat behind pink gauze in the highest room of the fortress, embroidering flowers with hands that could kill anyone alive, and his voice through the curtain was soft as silk because the martial art that had made him the strongest man in the world had slowly been unmaking the man of him for years. He'd paid for the summit with everything he was. Everyone in that cult was terrified of him. His own stewards counted the days behind his back, and when a nobody walked in bluffing a needle trick, he lifted the gauze himself and tested me. Flicked embroidery needles at me faster than sight, a casual little death, and I caught the rhythm and sent them ricocheting back to hang in a ring around his own head. He went very still. Then Peerless Cloud, the loneliest killer in creation, smiled at me like a man who'd heard his own language spoken for the first time in years. You didn't flinch, he said. You weren't going to hit me, I said. You were going to see what I'd do. And what would you like from me, he said, now that you've impressed me? A haul? A rank? Men? His voice had gone flat, tired. It was the question he asked everyone because the answer was always the same and it was always the beginning of a betrayal. Nothing, I said, and meant it. I'm just passing through. That was the whole thing between us, sealed in one word. Everyone in his life wanted his power, his title, his death. I wanted none of it, and he could feel that on me like a change in the weather. The one person in his world who wasn't measuring the distance to his throne. He made me his vice chief. I took the power he handed me and immediately reorganized his cult into a council so I'd hold less of it, not more, and it baffled and delighted him. Two people who'd each climbed to the top of a different everything and found only wind up there. We talked, really talked, the way two lonely people do when they finally meet someone who isn't angling for a thing. He was the closest to a peer I ever found on the road, and I knew, because I'd read that world the way I read all of them, roughly how his story was supposed to end. I said nothing. I told myself I had time. I always think I have time. I kept robbing the place blind, understand? Friendship is friendship. The multiverse doesn't fund itself. The prize on that mountain was a sword art called the 9 Swords of Dugu, a technique with no defense in it at all, only attack, built on the idea that everything that lives has a flaw and a good enough blade simply goes to the flaw. It belonged by fate to a young swordsman named Zhang Hong, a decent drunk with a good heart and terrible luck, and I found him and offered to gift him a technique, and while I pressed 2 fingers to his forehead and copied the 9 swords straight off him, 5 gigabytes, 8 minutes, I pasted my own block skill back into him in trade. Fair's fair. I don't like leaving a man poorer than I found him, even while I'm picking his pocket. That block I gave him would matter later, in the worst possible way. Every gift I hand out in these worlds is also a fuse, and I never know which ones are lit. The 9 swords, by the way, that's the blade a chain-smoking robot named Titan Grey will one day swing through a Decepticon's arm on a plane that hasn't been dreamed of yet. I stole it off a sad drunk on a mountain a lifetime before there was anything on wheels to swing it at. That's how the loot travels out here. Keep watching it move. I went after the greatest internal energy art in that world too, the one hoarded in a mountain temple. And it nearly got me killed, and instead taught me the single most useful lesson about my own cheat. Because when I went to take it, the whole righteous world ganged up on me, and among them was a monster whose entire power was draining the strength out of other men through his palms, the same art that would one day kill Peerless Cloud. He got his hands on me, certain he was about to leave me empty, and it barely tickled. He drank the small, honest cultivation I'd grown by hand and found nothing else to take, because my real strength was never internal energy at all. It was magnetism, a thing that lives in the metal and not in me, a thing his art had no teeth for. He stood there baffled, thinking he'd disarmed me, while I reached out with the power he couldn't touch and took an arm off the proudest master in the circle and stepped off a cliff, and the whole self-righteous world went home certain the demon sword saint was dead. Nobody in any of these worlds ever loses to me as badly as the ones who think they've finally understood how I work. I got famous doing it, too famous. I crashed a gathering of the self-righteous sword sects, and when they moved to execute one of my cult's old men, I made a sword fly, controlled a blade through the air with a raised hand, severed an arrogant master's hand at the wrist in a single pass, turned another man's own sword to point at his throat. In a world where making a sword hover was a legend told about dead immortals, I did it in front of 100 witnesses, and they named me the Ghost Hand Sword Saint, and my fame climbed until it stood beside Peerless Cloud's own, which is exactly the kind of shine that gets a man killed by the people standing closest to him. His name was Zhou Wenlong, Cloud's favorite steward, jealous and clever and frightened, who'd watched a stranger become the master's one confidant in a single month and could not stand it. So he forged an order in Cloud's own hand, an execution order with my name on it, and marched me off a cliff path to be killed quietly where the master would never hear about it. I let his 2 executioners get their knives all the way up. Then I let their knives find each other instead of me, a twist of magnetism, 2 blades crossing into the wrong throats, and I caught Zhou Wenlong by his fine collar with every right in the world to end him. I didn't. He was Cloud's favorite, and I don't kill a friend's things, even the ugly ones. So I carved 4 lines into that pretty jealous face, a signature, a warning, and let him run. That mercy is the one move in all my worlds I would take back. because Zhou Wenlong's betrayal was a symptom, and in my arrogance, I treated the symptom and ignored the disease, and the disease was that peerless Cloud, the strongest man in the world, was surrounded on every side by people who wanted him dead and had exactly one friend, and his one friend was a thief on a schedule whose palm was already filling up with frost. The end came while I was away. An old enemy of Cloud's, a monster named Zitian Bao, whose whole art was drinking the power out of other people through the skin of his palms, stormed the fortress to take back the cult, and he didn't come alone. He brought a small army of the ambitious and the desperate, and he brought Zhang Hong. Peerless Cloud met all of them at once, in his red dress, without setting down his embroidery, and he was winning, one man against a room, and winning because he really was invincible. The name was just a fact, and then the sad decent drunk I'd handed a gift to used my gift to kill my friend. The block skill I'd pasted into Zhang Hong's hands, fair and square, let him stop the one strike he could never have survived otherwise, and in the half-second that bought, Xietian Bao got his palms on Cloud and began pulling the life out through them. My trade, my fuse, lit at the worst possible instant in the worst possible hand. I felt it go wrong from across the mountain, and I flew, actually flew, standing on a sword, driving it through the air with everything the world had taught me, and I got there too late by minutes. The hall was wrecked. Cloud was down in a spreading dark stain, the red dress darker still, his terrible hands finally empty of any needle. I dropped beside him and took one of those hands, skin to skin, for the first time in all the months I'd known him. He was glad it was me. That's the part I carry. Dying on the floor of a cult he'd ruled through fear, in a room full of people who'd come to watch him die, the last face he got was the one man who'd never wanted a thing from him, and he was glad. You came, he said, not surprised, just glad. I was too slow, I said. I'm sorry, I'm so slow. He told me, in that soft, ruined voice, that I'd been his one true confidant, that in a whole life at the top of everything, I was the only person who had ever simply talked to him. He said his single regret was that he had not been allowed to be born a woman, that the shape of his own longing had never once gotten to be a simple thing, and then he asked me for the only thing he ever asked me for. The dress, he breathed. Don't let them burn it. Let one person remember I wore it. I said yes. It's folded in my storage to this day, and it has crossed 9 worlds with me, and I have never once been tempted to leave it behind. Then I stood up and paid the debt the way my home had taught me to pay debts. Shi Tianbao tried to hide behind a hostage, grabbed the boy at the edge of the room and held him up like a shield, certain the way villains are always certain that a hero won't risk the innocent. But I'm not a hero, and 3 years in an apocalypse had burned the flinch out of me. I didn't slow down. I sent a dozen needles and a sword on curves that went around the boy. Magnetism does not care about a straight line, and put every one of them into the thing behind him. Zitian Bao came apart around his own stolen power. The hostage lived. I simply declined to let a villain use my mercy as a wall, because I'd already learned in that exact room what one act of mercy costs. I buried Peerless Cloud on his mountain, in his dress, under his real name, which almost no one alive knew. And then I made the world that killed him regret standing so close. The self-righteous sects gathered at the great temple to congratulate one another on ridding the world of the demon and his sword saint, and I walked in alone, and when their loudest hypocrite stood to denounce me, I took his head off in one motion, a sword curving around his raised guard as if his whole defense were a suggestion. Into the silence, I named my price for Peerless Cloud, their deepest treasures, and 10 years of silence behind closed doors, and when they balked, I lifted every sword in the temple at once, 100 blades hanging point down over 100 proud heads, and the whole righteous world surrendered to a single grieving thief. I took a great internal energy scripture off the monks, memorized it, and burned the paper at Cloud's grave so no one would ever hold it again. Then the frost finished crawling across my palm, and the vortex came, and I left that world carrying a legendary sword art, a folded red dress, and the permanent knowledge that the worst wound I take in any world is never the one that lands on me. It's the one I could have stopped a month earlier if I'd killed a jealous little man when I had him by the collar, instead of being merciful and going home to check on a friend a day too late. Home again. The forest this time, where I'd left the bear and Lin Ruoxi's crew long gone, back to Hero City, safe. I'd changed since they'd scanned me at 5. A month in a poison cult, a legendary sword art, a folded red dress, and the slow, honest wisp of internal energy I'd cultivated by hand had pushed me up into the 10s now, a veteran on that little detector, and the forest felt smaller for it. I might have gone straight for the base. Instead, I heard a gunshot, and a child screaming, and I did the thing that would change the whole rest of my story. There was a little girl running through the trees. Maybe 10 years old, in a filthy white dress, moving faster than any child has a right to, awakened then, and running for her life, and behind her a big man with a rifle taking his time, hurting her, enjoying it. I stepped out between them and told him to stop. He didn't. He swung the rifle on me instead, and I recognized the patch on his shoulder before I recognized the cruelty on his face. The guard team. My father's guard team, the unit he'd built to protect Dalongshan's people, now out in the woods hunting a child for a bounty because Wang Wei had put a price on things again, and this was what my father's legacy had been turned into. I took the rifle out of the man's hands with a thought, and I took his head off with the flying sword I'd carried out of the last world, and I did not lose 1 minute of sleep over it. The apocalypse teaches you a short arithmetic. A man who hunts children subtracts cleanly. The girl didn't thank me. She didn't say anything at all. She backed off to the tree line and watched me with the flat, wary eyes of an animal that has learned that the thing which saves you and the thing which cages you often wear the same coat. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't come close. So I did the only thing that ever works with something that's scared. I stopped trying. I caught a snake and roasted it and left half of it on a rock and went and sat on the other side of the fire and minded my own business. It took 2 days for her to take the food, and she did it in a snatch and retreat, the way a wild thing does, watching my hands the whole time to see if the trap was going to spring. It didn't spring. The next day I left more, and didn't watch her eat, and pretended to sleep so she could relax enough to actually chew. I never once reached for her. When the dead wandered too close in the night, I put them down quietly and went back to my side of the fire, so she'd learn that the strong thing in the dark was pointed outward, at the world, not at her. Slowly, the distance closed. 3 paces became 2. 2 became a spot just close enough to the fire that I could feel her there. And one cold night, I woke to a small weight against my side and a fistful of my sleeve gripped tight in a sleeping hand, and I lay very still until morning so I wouldn't wake her, because I had not been trusted like that by anything in 3 years, and I found I was not willing to spend a wink of it. You don't earn that kind of trust by being strong. You earn it by being boring and warm, and there in the morning, over and over, until the wariness runs out of reasons. While I was busy being patient, the world got worse, the way it does. Something new had shown up out in the ruins, a zombie that could think, a commander. Most of the dead are just appetite on legs, but this one was intelligent, and it had gotten its hooks into the hordes and driven tens of thousands of them into a frenzy, and now they were pressing in on Dalongshan, and the whole region was a churning war between the dead and the wrong-shaped beasts. I filed it under problems for a stronger man, which I fully intended to become. That intention got tested when a 2-meter slab of a man in iron armor tried to ambush me, turned invisible, and came in swinging a warhammer, quite pleased with himself. The trouble with ambushing a man who feels metal is that armor is metal, and I felt him coming like a struck bell. I took his hands off before his hammer finished its arc, and while he was reconsidering his career, I copied the thing that made him briefly interesting. Invisibility, 4 gigabytes, filed neatly onto the D drive next to Block and the 9 swords. A power that would, several worlds later, let me walk unseen through a base full of Decepticons, picking them off one at a time. I took his crystal detector too. He wasn't using it anymore. I named the girl Ling Shu. Little dream. She'd started sleeping curled against my side by then, the way a stray finally does when it decides you're the least dangerous thing in a dangerous world, and I'd catch myself keeping watch a little longer so I wouldn't wake her. I don't have a tidy explanation for it. 3 years of apocalypse had scraped most of the soft parts out of me. I'd watched a friend die and curved needles around a hostage without slowing down. But this silent, feral, filthy little girl had decided I was safe, and something in me that I'd thought was gone decided it would rather die than prove her wrong. Which raised a question I hadn't had to ask before. My month was almost up, the frost was near the edge of my palm, and I was not going to leave her in that forest for the guard team to find again. So I tested a theory. I held her while she slept. Did it while she slept on purpose, because I wasn't ready to explain the vortex to anyone, least of all a child who trusted me, and when the pull came, I held on, and she came with me. A living person, carried through the gap between worlds in my arms. It worked. The rules had another door in them I hadn't known about, and it opened both ways. If I could carry my world's people out, I could one day carry other worlds' people in. That thought would grow teeth later. For now, it just meant that when I fell out of the sky into the next world, I fell holding a sleeping little girl, and I was, against all odds and most of my own history, not alone anymore. We landed in a pirate world. You'd know it. Straw hats, devil fruits, a sea full of monsters and idiots, most of them lovable. We came down years before any of the famous parts, which meant the future king of the pirates was currently 9 years old, snot-nosed, made of rubber, and absolutely certain he was the strongest thing on 2 legs. Rio. I copied the best thing he had before he was old enough to know he had it. There's a rare kind of will in that world, conqueror's hockey, the pressure of a king, the thing that makes weaker men faint from being looked at, and most people who have it don't awaken it for decades. Rio had it at 9, because Rio was Rio. 13 gigabytes, the biggest single gene I'd copied yet, off a giggling child who thought the light on my palm was a magic trick and demanded I do it again. He called me uncle. He decided Ling Shu was my daughter and therefore his cousin, and that as his cousin she was obligated to help him become Pirate King. She stared at him. She'd found, at last, someone she outranked in dignity, and she intended to enjoy it. Then his grandfather arrived, and I learned what the top of a world actually looks like. Ace. A marine, an old man, a walking landslide who trained his grandson by throwing punches that leveled hills and calling it love. I'd been feeling pretty good about myself. A legendary sword art, magnetism, invisibility, a crystal count climbing toward 100. I pointed my stolen detector at Ace out of habit, the way you'd check the weather. It read 4,260. Back home, the tyrant sitting in my father's chair, the man I'd been quietly planning my whole life around, scanned at 300. Ace would have sneezed and ended him. That number rearranged something in my head permanently. I wasn't strong. I was early. There was a ceiling so far above me I couldn't see it, and the only road up was to keep robbing my way there. So naturally, I got the old mountain to adopt me. I posed my flying swords as a devil fruit and played the promising young stranger, and Ace, who collected talented brats the way other men collect regrets, clapped a hand on my shoulder that nearly drove me through the deck and announced he'd train me personally. This turned out to mean surviving him. He shipped me to the Great Marine Fortress and spent a month teaching me by trying to kill me every morning before breakfast. He put weighted chainmail on me and Rio and made us run the walls. I magnetically lightened Ling Shu's share when I thought no one was looking because she was 10 and it was cruel, and Ace caught it instantly with a sense so sharp it read the future in the air and pinged me in the forehead with a pebble at 40 meters to let me know. That's observation hockey. I copied it off him. And armament hockey too. The art of turning your own body harder than steel, straight off the hand of a man ranked 4,000, and then sat there unable to run a bite of either, because copying the file isn't the same as being able to open it. One training session, I braced against a punch wrong and cracked the fortress deck clean across, and the old man fined me 1,000 berries for damaging Navy property and made me pay it out of an allowance he then declined to give me. Ace dropped his grandson back home at the windmill town before we shipped out, and Rio clung to the mast and howled that he'd grow up strong and steal his uncle back from the boring Navy, and I told him I'd hold him to it, and I meant it more than he knew. You never turn down a future pirate king who owes you a favor. Then it was just me and the old landslide sailing to the great naval headquarters, a month of open water and daily attempted murder, the weights climbing until my knees complained. At the headquarters, he dumped me on a sleepy, yawning vice admiral named Aokiji to get me properly enrolled, a man who could turn the sea to ice and mostly looked like he'd rather be napping, and who watched the new prodigy with one lazy half-open eye that I did not for 1 second believe was actually sleepy. The dangerous ones never are. But I had a foundation nobody in that world had, the internal energy I'd cultivated by hand in the sword world. Hockey, it turns out, is just will and spirit poured into the body, and I already knew how to pour. I condensed real armament hockey in a single week, fingertip going black and hard as obsidian, using a technique I'd stolen from a 4,000-point grandfather, and Marine headquarters decided I was a once-in-a-century genius. The genius bit became the best running joke of that whole world. They'd watch me learn in 7 days what took veterans a decade and gasp and promote me, and I'd nod humbly and mention my legs were sore from the effort. That same sleepy vice admiral, Aokiji, watched me master their vanishing step movement art in a week and said, around a yawn, "That's not normal, you know. I'm a hard worker," I told him. A furious magma-blooded admiral who hated Aokiji took note. The old commander-in-chief took note. I collected the attention of the most dangerous men in the world's most powerful navy by being a fraud with excellent source material, and I have never once felt bad about it. Then they put me on a warship and sent me to a real fight, and I got to watch a monster work. Aokiji's ship ran down a pirate family, the smiling, dangerous kind, squabbling over a lost devil fruit, a smoke power meant as a gift to a worse crew still. Aokiji froze the entire sea, turned an ocean to a white plain in a breath, an ice age, and walked across it toward the pirates like a man crossing a parking lot, and I understood in my bones the difference between my clever thefts and the raw fact of a top-tier power. The pirates' champion was a diamond-skinned giant named Pika, a grinning butcher who bent his own weapons like ribbons, and he nearly took Kobe's head while the fruit was still loose on the ice. That's where I earned my keep. I magnetically snatched up 24 fallen sabers off the frozen deck and drove the whole flock of them at the Diamond Man at once, a storm of steel from every angle, and it didn't hurt him, but it made him cover up, and covering up was all the time Kobe needed. In the chaos, the loose fruit rolled across the ice, and Kobe snatched it up and ate it rather than let pirates have it, and I filed away for later that a devil fruit will simply sit there waiting to be swallowed by whoever's got the nerve. A worse crew arrived, giant and grinning, and we pulled back and I got promoted again for the parts of the fight I'd actually helped with. Lieutenant, now. Nearly 100 points. Climbing. The best and worst thing that happened in that world happened on a snow island, and it belonged to Ling Shu. We were cornered there, me and a furious, brilliant 15-year-old named Eustace Kid that I'd pulled out of a pirate's hands, by a smiling slab of a colonel named Doflamingo, a mole for the smiling pirates, so tough my best armament strike bounced off his neck, with a permanent smear of food on his cheek that nobody in the history of that world had dared to mention. I needed an edge. There was another of those loose fruits in the water offshore, a snow logia, and I sent Ling Shu down for it, because she swam like an otter, and the enemy wasn't watching the child. She got it. And then, 10 years old, and having watched me pose as invincible for weeks, she made a decision I never told her to make. She ate it, to keep it from the enemy, exactly like the Marine had. And a devil fruit and seawater do not mix. The sea rejects the power and drags you down like a stone. So the second she swallowed it, her small body went limp and sank, and Doflamingo, delighted, dove after both of us to drown us where our fruit powers would leave us helpless. Except I don't have a devil fruit. The sea has no hold on me. Doflamingo hauled me under certain I'd go weak, and I simply reached out with a magnet's hand, lifted Kid and my drowning little girl clear of the water and up the beach, and vanished, invisible, gone. A man with no body to find. He circled the empty shore until he gave up and left, looking for corpses that had walked off. Ling Shu coughed the sea back up on the sand and lived, and now carried a Logia power in her small body, a thing that would one day mean nobody in the apocalypse could put a blade in her, because you cannot cut snow. I'd been so busy stealing gods I'd nearly gotten her killed for an edge. I did not let that happen twice. That's a promise I made on a cold beach, and mostly kept. The kid I'd saved was worth the trouble. 15, furious, brilliant, and holding a genius's understanding of the blade. I told him the truth. I told all my best marks. That my power was a trade, not a theft, and proved it by copying the raw swordsmanship knowledge out of his head, 4 gigabytes, and it unlocked a whole new drive in me, the E-drive, the one that holds pure knowledge, technique, and physics and understanding, the things you can't just be born with. I filled the first folder of it with a 15-year-old's genius and paid him back with my block skill, and we parted as something like friends. I'd started collecting those. A drunk swordsman on one mountain, a doomed emperor on another, a rubber child, a knife-eyed boy on a beach, a thief who can only take by holding on ends up, it turns out, holding a lot of hands. I left that world officially dead. There was a boy in the south who'd eaten a real magnet fruit and started calling himself a monster, and because I'd spent the whole world posing as a magnet fruit user, the smiling pirate king and the sleepy ice admiral put 2 and 2 together and got a tidy 5. The strange marine genius must have died, and his fruit reincarnated in the boy. Perfect. Let the record show I died a hero of the Marines at 100 points and rising. The frost reached the edge of my palm, and I gathered up my snow-powered daughter and my head full of hockey, and the vortex took us home. I came home a different animal that time. Snow-powered daughter at my side, conqueror's will in my blood, armament hockey in my fist, the vanishing step in my legs, and a crystal count that had crossed into the hundreds, a third-tier monster now, by the ranking I taught you, the band my father had died in. The forest around Dalongshan had become a churn of dead and beasts tearing at each other under that thinking zombie's command, and where a year ago I'd have crept through it praying, now Ling Shu walked ahead of me, flattening whole packs of the dead with waist-high blizzards, and when a third-tier corpse vulture the size of a fishing boat dropped on us, I let it swallow my sword whole, and then opened my hand, and it came apart from the inside without my ever touching a feather. We didn't sneak into Dalongshan. We walked up to the gate in the middle of a monster war like we owned the weather, and the walls went very quiet watching us come. Inside, 2 reunions were waiting, one warm and one overdue. The warm one was an old one-armed man named Elder Jang, who could make plants do his bidding, and who my father had pulled out of a bad end years back. He was the last man in that base still loyal to the dead chief's memory out loud, and when he got a good look at my face under 3 years of change, he knew me, actually knew me, and his eyes did a thing I hadn't let myself want. Somebody in that place remembered whose son I was and was glad, not calculating, just glad. In a base full of people who'd let me be sent to die, Elder Jang was proof my father had built something real, and it had simply been buried under a usurper for a while. The overdue reunion was with the usurper. Wang Wei had told the base I was dead. Again, he was fond of declaring me dead. It was practically a hobby, and he'd thrown Lin Ruoxi and her Hero City crew in a cell as spies for having the bad manners to know me. So I walked into his hall, and I let him look at the nobody he'd sealed behind a shutter, now standing there at 108 points with a monster leopard's worth of menace and a 10-year-old who could freeze a room. You could watch the arithmetic hit him. The air he'd left in a mall was third tier, impossible. He'd been third tier for years, clawing every point. I'd done it in months, and he had no idea how. And not knowing how is the specific thing that keeps a tyrant awake. The base had a rule my father had written. Any third tier awakened earned a seat on the council automatically. Wang Wei couldn't refuse me the seat without admitting he feared me, so he did the tyrant thing. He arranged a test, a spar, dressed up as ceremony. He put up his own woman. Her name was Spark, and she'd awakened into pure speed, a streak you couldn't track with the eye, third tier and vicious, and she came at me like her name. I want you to remember her, because this is the light part of her story, and the light part doesn't last. I caught her speed with the vanishing step, which is speed with a plan, and I put her on the floor with the flat of a blade, gently, because I had no quarrel with her. My quarrel was with the man who'd sent her, and I took my seat at the table as the 13th counselor, while Wang Wei smiled the way you smile when someone's just proven they can reach across the table anytime they like. I couldn't kill him yet. Understand that this is the whole ache of the middle of my story. I was strong enough to embarrass him, and not strong enough to end him cleanly in a hall full of his people, and a botched revenge is just a warning you gave your enemy for free. There was a thinking zombie outside driving 100,000 of the dead against our walls, and even Wang Wei and I, who wanted each other gone, needed the walls to hold. So we went to a cold war. He schemed. I built. He was good at it. I'll give him that. He couldn't move against me openly with the horde at the gate, so he moved sideways. Cut my faction's rations to the bone and called it fair shares, handed my people the worst wall shifts and the deepest scouting runs, let quiet rumors go around that the chief's son had come back wrong, changed, not quite human after those long strange absences of his. Every one of those moves was a small knife, and I let each one land, because a man who's throwing small knives is a man who's afraid to throw a big one, and fear makes people patient right up until it makes them stupid. I answered every knife by simply being useful in public. I put my leopard and my snow child on the wall when the swarm pushed hardest and broke attacks the base had been bleeding against for weeks, and I let the ordinary people do the math on who actually kept them alive. You don't win a base by killing the man in the chair. You win it by being the one the walls would rather have. I got Lin Ruoxi and her crew out of that cell and put them in the best housing in the core district because she'd broken her arm for a stranger once, and I pay my debts with interest. And then I did the thing that would eventually make my little faction the most dangerous block in the base. I opened my hands and gave my power away. I told them the truth, or a workable slice of it, that I was an awakened who could turn fiction into fact, who could gift a skill the way you'd hand over a tool. I pasted real hockey foundations into Heavy Bark, the big lecherous gunman, who wept actual tears over finally being taken seriously. I gave the quiet fire thrower the internal cultivation to make his flames a discipline instead of a tantrum. And to Lin Ruoxi, my first friend in the apocalypse, I gave the supreme art I'd carried out of the sword world in a folded red dress, the highest cultivation peerless cloud ever walked, the one suited to a woman's path, no terrible price attached to her the way it had been to him. I watched my one true friend's legacy take root in the hands of the first person who'd ever saved my life, and if you're keeping track of how the loot travels, that's the trait I'm proudest of in all of it. A dead man's art, given to a living woman in a world neither of them was born in. They grew fast, all of them, that quiet month, while the frost crawled back across my palm. Lin Ruoxi climbed toward the third tier. My faction had a leopard's teeth and a dead friend's art and a snow child and a growing pile of gifted power, and across the yard Wang Wei counted us and didn't sleep well, and I let him not sleep, and I buried a cheap digital watch by the wall to measure how much real-world time each of my trips was eating, because I was starting to plan around the schedule now, starting to think like a man with a campaign instead of a man with a curse. Then the vortex came, and I left my little army growing in the ground like something planted, and fell into a world of martial tyrants and 2,000-year-old immortals. This next world ran on swords, and I want to tell you about it mostly because of one blade. Somewhere down the line you're going to watch a thin, whisper-light sword orbit my body like a moon, cut a war machine in half, split itself into 100 copies of itself. People always ask where I got it. I stole it off an old woman who owned the most feared weapon in her world, and I got it by making a heavy thing heavier at exactly the right second. But first I had to get hired by a tyrant. The world was ruled by a man everyone called the Tyrant, a martial fanatic with a grip like a landslide who collected strong people the way other men collect stamps. He collected me the way he collected everyone, by attacking me on sight. 3 of his signature killing techniques, one after another, thrown at a stranger on the road. I shrugged all 3 off. Block for the palm, the vanishing step out of the fist, a shoulder into the leg sweep, and the tyrant stopped and looked at me with the flat hunger of a man who's just found a new thing to own. "You'll run one of my halls," he said. Not an offer. "I'll run one of your halls," I agreed, because I wanted exactly that, access to his masters and his vaults. He was holding 2 unconscious little boys when we met, a pair of 10-year-olds he'd just taken by force after breaking their father, and if you know that world, you know those two boys grow up to be its entire story. I filed them under other people's plot and got to work. I did what I always do in a martial world, trained like a lunatic off the local masters and grabbed a future ally while he was still young enough to shape. This one was a proud, discarded young swordsman named Gao Yun, sharp and bitter and talented, whom the tyrant had rejected. I took him as my disciple and poured Haki and the Vanishing Step into him. "Why me?" he asked the first day. He threw me away. "Because he throws away everything he can't immediately use," I said, "and I'm collecting exactly those things." He worshipped me a little after that. They usually do. It's astonishing what teaching a thrown-away kid one impossible technique buys you in loyalty. The good stuff on that world lived in a place called Peerless City, guarded by an old woman named Mei Lin and a divine sword that could cut through anything. Which sounds terrifying until you remember that a divine sword is still a sword, and a sword is still metal, and I have an understanding. She scanned at 350, and well above me, a real monster, and when I came for the blade, she swung the single most feared weapon in her world straight at my head. I made it weigh 10,000 pounds. Magnetism doesn't care how holy your sword is, it cares that it's steel. The blade slammed down out of her hands and cratered the floor, and while the old woman stared at her own legend gone suddenly immovable, I lifted the peerless sword off the stone and walked out of the most secure vault in that world, invisible before the gate finished sounding its alarm. 350 points of Guardian, undone by a man of 200 who understood that her weapon was also mine any second I chose to reach for it. That's the whole cheat in one gesture. That's the blade you'll watch cut a Decepticon in half. I got it by turning a legend into a dumbbell, but the sword wasn't even the best thing I stole on that world. Flying out of Peerless City, my own blades started to shake and bow on their own, dipping their points toward a little house I was passing, because the man who lived there had gone so deep into the way of the blade that every sword within 100 feet lowered itself in respect without being told to. His name was Shadow, and he was, hands down, the greatest swordsman I ever met in any world. I landed at his door and ran the old palm reading con, 5 years and 4 universes, and it still worked. Took the master's hand, told him his own future to hold his attention, and copied 28 gigabytes of pure sword mastery, the biggest single scoop of raw knowledge I ever took. It ate nearly half my knowledge drive by itself, one man's whole lifetime of understanding poured into me through a handshake. And it mattered more than the magic blade because up to that point my stolen sword arts had been hollow. I had the 9 swords of Dugu but no swordsman's soul to run them on. I knew the moves and understood none of the wisdom under them, like a man who's memorized a language but can't mean anything in it. After Shadow, my swordplay had a soul. It stopped being a stolen technique and started being mine. Every blade I've swung since, every one you'll watch me swing at the giants, moves the way it does because of 28 gigabytes I lifted off a hermit while lying to his face about tomorrow. I paid that world back the way I like to. There was a sword saint on it walking a road that was going to kill him, a cultivation that demanded he cut away his own heart, his own feeling, to reach the summit. With a Grandmaster's kendo freshly loaded in my head, I could see the flaw in his path, and I taught him a better one, a cripple yourself and rebuild method that got him to the top without hollowing him out, changed his ending. I can't walk through a tragedy without rearranging the furniture. It's a compulsion. The one who nearly killed me on that world wasn't the tyrant. It was a smiling old man I helped up off the road out of ordinary courtesy, who turned out to be a 2,000-year-old immortal named Lord Ming, patient and hollow and mad in the specific way very old, very powerful things go mad. He kept himself alive across the centuries on a phoenix's blood, and he wanted my prophecy to help him hunt a dragon for its essence, and for a while that made me useful, and useful is safe. I brought the immortal and his beautiful deadly daughter back to the tyrant's gang like a man walking a tame nuclear bomb through his rival's living room, and it paid an immediate comedy dividend. The tyrant, humiliated that a hired hallmaster had grown stronger than him, decided to settle it the coward's way, a night raid on my room, except I'd swapped rooms, on a hunch, and the tyrant crept in and threw his full killing strength at the sleeping shape in my bed, which turned out to be a 2,000-year-old immortal who did not so much as wake up gracefully. Ming took 3 of the tyrant's world-shaking palms without a bruise, blinking like a man bothered by a mosquito, and then the immortal's daughter broke the tyrant's arm for the interruption. The most feared man in that world crawled back to his own quarters with his entire understanding of reality in pieces, and spent the next stretch of the story hiding in a cave questioning the point of existence. I have rarely enjoyed anything more. Then came the Mid-Autumn Duel, and it's the reason the immortal turned on me. The tyrant, to rebuild his shattered pride, had challenged the sword saint I'd saved, the 2 strongest blades in that world, on a tower under a full moon, and half the martial world came to watch. I'd privately told Ming the sword saint would win, because that's how the story I knew went. But I'd changed the story. I'd pulled the sword saint off his self-destroying path and onto a steadier one, and a steadier man fights a longer fight. The duel went the distance and ended in a dead draw, two titans bowing to each other and agreeing to meet again. A beautiful thing to witness. A catastrophe for me, because a fortune teller who misses is not a fortune teller. He's a loose end. When Ming cornered me to test whether I was real, I threw everything I had at getting away. The vanishing step, flying, invisibility, the trick that had beaten Crystal Count's triple mine, and every one of them slid off his ancient senses like water off glass, because he didn't perceive the world the way younger things do. He felt souls, straight through walls and invisibility and speed. There is nowhere to hide from a man who can feel your spirit in the dark, and for about 10 seconds I understood exactly how every one of my marks had felt the moment they realized the prophet had lied. I got out on a bluff and a schedule. I read his palm one last time and nailed his age and his name and his dragon-hunting heart so precisely that it froze him, and in the second his certainty wavered, the frost finished crossing my palm. As the vortex opened, I grabbed the immortal by the front of his robe and promised him, with a lunatic's whole conviction, to drag him down to hell with me, and a 2,000-year-old creature who had never once feared death flinched from a madman's grip just long enough for the world to pull me out. I left him standing alone, robbed of a phoenix bloodline he never felt me scan, wondering for the rest of his long life who the smiling fortune teller really was. That world cost me a few gray hairs and paid me a legendary blade and a swordsman's soul. A good trade. I've made worse. And the next world was the one where I finally stopped robbing mortals and started robbing gods. I landed in a superhero movie, the big one, the crossover, a secret base. A glowing cube on a pedestal. A lot of very serious men in tactical gear about to have the worst day of their careers. I knew exactly where I was and exactly what was about to walk through the light, because where I'm from, this one made $1 billion. The cube on the pedestal, the tesseract, was already tearing a hole in the air, and out of the hole stepped a tall, grinning, horned disaster named Set, holding a spear with a glowing stone in its head. I thought, gods. Finally. Let's see what a god copies for. He opened by touching that spear to a nearby agent's chest and turning the man's eyes a docile blue. Mind control. Instant. One of the base's best archers, now his puppet. When he turned the spear on me, I threw up a block, a hard shell of will I'd stolen off a poison cult, and his magic splashed off it. Set's grin faltered. He wasn't used to splashing. He came in physically, and I hit him with everything a stolen god's body had, and my best strike skidded right off his hide without leaving a mark. Because here's the annoying thing about gods, their bodies are simply built different, a frost giant under the skin, so I improvised. I kicked him. Kick away, a skill that sends a thing exactly as far as I want it to go, planted square in a trickster god's chest, and I punted the adopted prince of Asgard the length of a collapsing military base and through a concrete wall. The look on his immortal face going through that wall is a thing I'll treasure until I die. There is a specific joy in humbling something that has never once in its long life been humbled, and I was going to get to do it to much bigger things than Set before that world was through. The base was coming down around us. Set had cracked the whole thing on his way in, and I pulled the one-eyed spy master running it out of the rubble on a raft of steel plate. Stone, his name was. He looked up at the stranger who just drop-kicked a god and made the correct decision, which was to want me on the payroll. So I told him the useful lie I'd rehearsed on the way down, that I was a human, raised out among the stars, come home, harmless, helpful, on your side. It's astonishing what people will believe about a man who just kicked a god across a room. A kind agent named Griffin signed me in, and I went to work on the most ambitious shopping list I ever wrote in any world. Because this world had 6 of them. 6 infinity stones. The singularities that run reality itself, mind and power and space and time and soul, and one more. And it had a bloodline of literal thunder gods, and it had a metal called vibranium that eats force and hands it back tripled. I didn't come here to get strong. I came to loot the treasury of creation, and I started with the man who had the best toys. I recruited Victor Kestrel the way I recruited everyone, by beating him. He flew at me in a suit of powered armor worth more than most countries, and I raised one hand and closed it, and crushed the suit shut around him like a soda can. Because a flying suit of metal versus a man who owns metal is not a fight, it's a public service announcement. He took it better than I expected, popped the faceplate on the wreck and looked up at me and said, "Okay, that's a new one." And by that evening we were drinking on the top floor of his tower, because he was the one man in that world as allergic to authority as I was, and we bonded instantly over the exact thing we were both quietly doing, which was hiding world-ending artifacts from our own governments. "There are 6 of them," I told him, and drew the stones out on his bar and spilled whiskey. "Whoever holds all 6 holds a snap of the fingers over every living thing. Your world has more than one. You're sitting on secrets that end galaxies, Victor, and you're using them to power a nightlight." He looked at the whiskey map for a long time. "You're a very reassuring houseguest," he said. I gave his soldier friend, the earnest one out of time they called Captain Valor, a foundation of hockey and the vanishing step, because a good soldier deserves good tools, and I liked him. And I took Victor's useless heirloom, a brick of vibranium his father had left him that no smith in that world could work. And because I understand force the way I understand metal, I reshaped it, right there in his lab, into gloves. A pair for him, a pair for me. Gauntlets that drink a blow and hand it back 3 times as hard. If you've been paying attention, you already know those gloves are still on my hands the day I catch a railgun round point blank on a hill full of Decepticons. I furnish my whole future in these worlds. Every room I rob decorates the next one. They kept the whole operation on a flying aircraft carrier, a city-sized fortress that hung in the sky on engines the size of houses, and it was aboard that thing that I met the rest of the cast. A soft-spoken doctor named Brooks, who kept a green monster folded up inside himself. 0 on my detector. No energy signature at all. Just a man and, underneath, a mountain of pure physical fury the numbers couldn't measure. And the earnest soldier out of time, whom I liked enough to actually train. It should have been the strongest room on Earth, and instead, it spent its days eating itself alive, because the men who ran the fortress had a secret. They were quietly building weapons out of the same cube Set had stolen, and my new friends were starting to notice, and nothing splits a team of powerful people faster than catching their own side lying. Set fed on that. He worked the powerful men of Earth through the Mind Stone in his spear, and arranged for the theft of the cube's weapons to be pinned on me, the convenient outsider, the alien who kicked a god through a wall, easy to fear. The council turned. The fortress turned. And for a bad little while I was the villain of their story, isolated by design, exactly the way a man like Set likes his enemies, but I felt the strings even where the humans couldn't. So I did the thing that keeps me alive. I stepped back, left the team, and let the honest ones, Victor, the captain, quietly take my side while the puppets isolated themselves. And the second I was alone, Set came for me in person, furious about a wall and a room full of witnesses to settle it, which was the last mistake he got to make before the sky opened. While Set was busy plotting his invasion, a second problem came through a different door. Dark sorcerers, servants of a thing that lives outside of time, sent to take a stone I'd gotten my hands on. They scanned at 800 apiece, monsters, well above me, and they cornered me at the top of Kestrel's tower, robes snapping, hands full of orange fire, and I flattened all of them in about a minute because I'd learned the one reliable weakness of magicians in every world I've ever robbed. Their glass cannons, gorgeous at range and helpless the instant a fast man closes the distance. I closed the distance. The stone they'd come for, the Mind Stone, did something wonderful while it sat against my chest through the whole fight. It turbocharged the exact kind of mental cultivation I'd been grinding since the Sword World, and my crystal count climbed while I slept. Their boss's boss arrived to collect the survivors, a bald woman in yellow robes who folded the air like cloth and opened a doorway between continents with a turn of her wrist. The elder sage. I looked at a person who could do with a gesture the thing I'd been dying to learn since I got trapped in a zombie tower 2 worlds ago, and I said the truest sentence I said in that whole world. Teach me. Then the aliens invaded, and I got to test all of it at once. The Battle of New York, a hole ripped in the sky over the city, and an army pouring through it on flying sleds, half-machine soldiers riding metal, a great mechanical serpent uncoiling out of the wound in the air behind them. For a man who owns metal, an army made of metal is not an invasion, it's a buffet. I crushed the flyers out of the sky by the dozen, just closed my fist and let them fall. I folded the mechanical serpent shut in midair like a paper toy. I used the Mind Stone like a grenade launcher that never runs out of grenades. And then I sprang the trap I'd spent the morning building. I'd wired Kestrel's tower into one enormous electrical field, run off his reactor, and I herded the bulk of the alien army into its range and threw the switch. Lit up half an invasion like a bug zapper the size of a skyscraper. When the Thunder God dropped into the battle mid-fight, I got him to pour his own lightning into my trap and double the yield. Teamwork. He was impressed. I was shopping. But the real moment, the one nobody else on that field even saw, happened at the very top. Because someone was watching that invasion the way I watch these worlds, from a distance, with a plan. A purple titan on a dead throne at the far end of the wormhole. The one who'd handed Set the spear as a scout, the one who wanted all 6 stones so he could erase half of everything that breathes with a snap. Kronos. When I moved to close the hole in the sky, he stood up off his throne and stepped through it to see who was interfering, and for one long second the two of us stood there at the top of the world, the mad gardener of the universe and a thief from an apocalypse, and not one other living being knew he was there. So I kicked him. Kick away, full force, both stolen godlegs behind it, square in that great purple chest, and I sent the mad titan stumbling back through his own portal a half step before he could plant a foot on that world, and then I slammed the sky shut on him. He didn't die. You don't kick Kronos to death. I'm not a fool. But he went home rattled, with a new line in his ledger, an unknown, a variable, a small strange man who'd put hands on him and lived, and I'd bought that whole world years it will never know it got, in a single kick nobody witnessed, all in a day's shopping. The biggest theft I saved for last, and it nearly killed me. I wanted the Thunder God's bloodline, real divine lineage, a body built to shrug off lightning and live for ages. So I ran the old palm reading con on Odin himself, told him his own tragic future to hold his attention and his hand, and copied 55 gigabytes of Asgardian godhood straight into my C drive. It jumped my genetic storage from 100 gigabytes to over 300 in one pull, not the thousands I'd greedily hoped for, because it turns out a god's lifespan scales with his strength, and I was, by Asgard's measure, a newborn, but a god's body nonetheless. The download was agony. Copying a gene that big means your own flesh has to rebuild itself around it, cell by cell, to hold the new blood, and a god's blood does not move in politely. It felt like being struck by lightning from the inside, over and over, for a length of time I have mercifully forgotten. My whole body rewrote itself, and I went down mid-sentence and stayed down, unconscious for 3 full days, while the team stood around my bed certain that reading the secrets of heaven had finally cost me something, that I'd looked too far into fate and paid the price the stories always warn about. I let them think it. It was easier than explaining that I'd simply bitten off a god and needed a minute to swallow. I woke up on the 3rd day, able to call lightning down out of a clear sky, with a thought, thunder answering my open hand, and that is the storm you'll watch me pour into a battlefield full of machines. That's the lightning you'll watch crawl up my arm on a battlefield full of robots. I bought it with 3 days of screaming I don't remember a second of. I finished that world in the Sorcerer's Temple, learning the last and most important tricks I ever stole. The elder sage thought she was training a magic prodigy. She was being watched by a copier memorizing her hands. Magic in that world wasn't a bloodline or a fruit or a gene I could pull off a drive. It was pure technique, precise gestures drawing precise shapes in the air, which meant for once I had to learn a thing the honest way, by watching and repeating until my hands knew it. I was very good at watching hands. She'd trace a ring of orange fire, a doorway hanging in nothing, and I'd copy the motion and the will behind it, and step through a hole in the world from one wing of the temple to another and back. She taught me to open portals across space, a door here, a door there, and you step between them across a continent, provided you've stood in both places first. And she taught me to fold off a mirror dimension, a pocket world laid over the real one, bent and silent, a place where I can put a thing and no one outside will ever hear it. The exact trick a Decepticon millions of years old will one day use on me and lose, because by the time he tries it, I'll have owned the technique for years. Hold on to both of those. A president of the United States is going to vanish out of a sealed bedroom because of the mirror trick, and an ancient Decepticon older than mammals is going to scream in a place no one can hear because of the same lesson, and I learned it standing in a hidden temple watching a bald woman's wrists. She was so impressed she sealed the temple's space to keep me 6 months as her student, which didn't slow the world jump one bit, but did let me meditate my crystal count to new heights, and on my way out she crafted me a pendant to hold the Mind Stone's power safely against my heart. I left that world carrying a stone of pure mind, a pair of force-tripling gloves, the blood and the lightning of a god, and the power to open doors through space and fold reality off to one side. I'd walked into that plane a man who robbed mortals. I walked out a man who'd kicked 2 gods across 2 continents and gone shopping in the vault of the universe, and I still wasn't finished. But the frost finished before I was, and the vortex threw me back home, to an apocalypse that had not been sitting quietly while I shopped. Home was at war when I got back, and this time I had the tricks to end it. The thinking zombie had stopped waiting. All those months it had been out in the ruins gathering the dead into an army. Now it had 100,000 of them pressed against Dalongshan's walls, and the council finally did the only thing left, which was to go kill the brain that ran the swarm. It lived in a tower in the dead city, the Jiayin building, a broken high-rise at the center of the horde, and the plan was two-handed: throw the whole base's strength at the swarm as a distraction, and slip a small sharp team through the gap to cut the head off the snake. I was on the small sharp team. So was Lin Ruoxi. So was Ling Shu, who would not be left behind and whom I'd stopped trying to leave. And so was Spark. I want you to remember I'd only ever put her on the floor gently. Wang Wei's woman, the speed awakened I'd embarrassed to win my council seat. She came on that mission and she fought well, and somewhere in that tower, when the trap closed on us, she died, because it was a trap. The thinking zombie was smarter than any of us had let ourselves believe, and it had walled us into the tower with 20 of its best evolved things, 3rd-tier horrors, one of them a psychic that could feel me even when I turned invisible. We fought in a collapsing high-rise in the dark, Ling Shu's blizzards clearing whole floors, my stolen swords doing the rest, and it should have been enough. But a plant-type thing came up through the floor where nobody was watching, and it took Spark through the middle before any of us could reach her, and she died with her eyes wide open, fast to the very end, and not fast enough. I didn't love her. I'd fought on the other side of her a week before, and I stood over her body in that ruined tower and felt the specific, useless anger of watching someone die who didn't have to, and I did not make a joke, because there's a rule I keep, and that was one of the moments it's for. I got the arm off the thinking zombie, sheared it clean, but I couldn't finish it in that swarm, and it fled deeper into its tower, and I told Lin Ruoxi to get Ling Shu out while I hunted the thing alone, which is how I ended up trapped, days, in that tower, that psychic zombie blocking my invisibility, the horde thick between me and the world, no way down that didn't cost more than I had. In the old days, that's where the story would have gotten very grim, but I'd just come back from robbing a temple of sorcerers, so I opened my hand, and I tore a door in space itself, and I stepped out of the middle of 100,000 zombies into clean air a mile away, and I have never in my life been so glad to have gone shopping. The portal magic paid for itself the first hour I owned it. Remember that trick too. It's the one that lets me walk out of every trap the rest of my story throws at me, including a few that come with alien war gods attached. On the way home, I picked up a mount. There was a beast prowling the ruins, an ink-black leopard the size of a horse, 3rd tier, 700 points of teeth and bad attitude, and I wanted it. So I folded it into my mirror pocket where it couldn't run, and I beat the pride out of it the honest way, and then I fed it and named it Nothing and let it decide on its own that my shoulder was the safest place in the apocalypse to stand. The ink cloud leopard. It's the monster at my side in the last chapter of the home story, the one nobody argues with. I met a solid man on that same trip too, a hero city mercenary named Guo Lei who could feel the ground for hundreds of yards and tell you what was hiding in it, and I portaled him home with me, because a man who can find what's buried is worth his weight when the enemy burrows, and the enemy was burrowing. The thinking zombie hadn't only thrown armies at our walls, it had slipped a single quiet killer inside them. A 3rd tier thing that moved through soil like a fish through water, that came up under a sleeping awakened in the dark and was gone before the scream finished, and it had been picking off my base one strong body at a time for weeks, a counselor among them, with nobody able to catch a thing that never surfaced twice in the same place. So I put my new ground reader to work, and for 2 long weeks Guo Lei and I hunted a rumor through the dark under Delongshan, feeling for a ripple in the earth that mostly wasn't there. We didn't get it that season. It felt him feeling for it and pulled back deep, patient as everything that zombie built was patient. But the base saw the exiled chief's son come home and immediately start protecting them from a horror the sitting leader hadn't even admitted was real, and people remember that kind of thing when the time comes to choose a side. I came back to Dalongshan with a god's lightning, a monster cat, a knack for walking through walls, and a base that had just lost a counselor to a zombie I'd failed to kill. Wang Wei had lost his woman on my mission, and he blamed me for it, and I let him, because the truth was worse. The truth was, I'd have traded 10 of his soldiers to keep Ling Shu safe and not felt it, and a man like that is not somebody you can reason your way past. The two of us circled each other across that base like the cold thing had teeth now. My faction had grown into the most dangerous block behind his walls. His had the seat of power and the loyalty of fear. Everyone could feel the fight coming. Nobody wanted to be the one to start it with the horde still at the gate. So we waited, both of us, and the frost crawled across my palm one more time and pulled me off to the gentlest world I ever visited, right when I'd gotten used to the loud ones. The gentle world dropped me into the courtyard of the kindest man alive, a young scholar named Liu Jinyuan, freshly crowned the top scholar in the whole empire, who found a filthy stranger in his garden and, instead of calling the guards, gave him silver, a hot meal, and an apology for the state of the tea. I knew that world too. A famous tragedy, the kind where everyone you come to like dies sad and exactly on schedule. And I looked at that decent boy pressing money into the hand of a man he thought was a thief, and I decided, the way I always decide, that I was going to rearrange the furniture. That world had a hero already, a grinning orphan swordsman named Xu Chang, and a girl he was fated to love and lose, a shy half-serpent named Chen Yun with a goddess's blood and a doomed future. And it had a proud martial daughter, Zhou Mei, who was holding a contest to pick a husband by combat, the exact contest that in the story I knew kicks off a love triangle that ends 3 lives badly. So when Xu Chang stepped up to fight for her hand, I kicked him off the platform before he could throw a punch. "Who?" he started from the ground. "Someone doing you a favor you'll never understand," I told him. I beat him without hurting him, a finger of sword energy, an armament hard knuckle, a touch of a god's lightning to make the point, and the shy serpent girl beside him answered my lightning with her own, a flicker of a goddess's power, testing me. I stepped their whole fated tragedy sideways in an afternoon. Their world's tragic hero grew up, in my version, without the wound the story wanted to give him. The proud daughter's father took one look at me and decided I should be his heir, wanted to marry me into his fortress on the spot, hand me a martial dynasty. I turned it down. I don't take a world's women any more than I take its thrones. I'm just passing through, and passing through with someone's daughter on your arm is how you leave a real wound behind you when the vortex pulls you out. Jo Mei slapped me for the refusal, humiliated in front of her father's whole hall, and I let her, because she was right to be angry, and I'd rather she was angry than in love with a man who'd vanish out of a sealed room in a month. I steered her gently toward the good scholar who actually adored her and took the scholar as my disciple and poured a swordsman's soul into him so the tragedy couldn't touch him. Standard god tourism. And then I met the villain, and he broke my heart a little. His name was Gu Fang, and the whole world called him the moon worship cult master, the great darkness, the sorcerer tyrant at the root of every evil in the story. He scanned at 1700, a genuine monster, far above me. And he came all that way to the Central Plains for one reason. He'd heard there was an outstanding young man who knew things, and he was starving for someone who knew things. So we sat down, the ultimate villain and the thief from the future, over a pot of instant noodles and a bottle of cola I'd carried out of a convenience store in the apocalypse, and I taught him science. I told him the earth was a ball, that it hung in nothing and swung around the sun, that the moon he worshipped was a dead rock borrowing the sun's light, that an eclipse was just a shadow, and gravity was just a rule, and there was nothing up there to pray to, only physics, vast and cold and beautiful. And this dreaded sorcerer, this apex of a world's evil, set down his chopsticks and looked at me the way a man dying of thirst looks at a river, because, and this is the part that got me, he'd already known. He'd suspected the earth was round for years. He tested it the only way a man of that world could. He had walked, for a very long time, in one direction, paying attention, until the evidence piled up that the ground curved away beneath his feet. He had figured out the shape of the world with his own 2 legs and his own stubborn mind, and he had told people, and not one soul in 1700 crystal points of power had believed him or cared. He wasn't a dark lord. He was the smartest man in a world too small for him, and the loneliness of being right and alone had curdled, over the years, into cruelty. I'd met a great many villains by then. He was the first one I understood all the way to the bottom. He tested me the way they all do. 3 moves, survive 3 moves. His energy blast bounced off the vibranium on my knuckles. His finger strike stopped dead against block. And when he threw a strike at my very soul, the mind stone at my chest turned it aside on its own and left him with a bloody nose and a stunned expression. Then he broke his word and came in for a 4th, so I kicked him across his own courtyard, and the entire watching world gasped that the outstanding young man had beaten the moon cult master in single combat. Only he and I knew the truth, that in a real fight he'd have unmade me, that I'd survived on stolen artifacts and good timing, not strength. But a rumor doesn't care about the truth. I walked out of that afternoon with a reputation for having beaten a world's greatest evil and a strange new student who kept sending me questions about the speed of sound. I spent the rest of that world doing the gentlest robbery of my career, which was turning a tragedy into something a person could stand to watch. I made a genuine friend on that plane too, a wine-soaked old sword immortal who wandered the land drunk and brilliant, the kind of man that world produces once an age. I won him over the only way that man could be won. I pulled a bottle of modern liquor out of my storage, the real stuff, 40 proof and merciless, and drank an immortal under a table for the first time in his very long life. He wept with joy over it, declared me the finest human being he'd ever met. We talked philosophy until sunrise the way you only can with a stranger who turns out to speak your language, and I liked him more than I've liked almost anyone, which is exactly why I was determined the story wasn't going to be allowed to kill him the way it wanted to, because that world's highest wisdom was a lie, and I could prove it. High on a sacred mountain lived its sword saint, an ascetic who'd cut every human feeling out of himself to reach enlightenment, and who taught that attachment was the enemy of the Tao. I climbed up and argued with him, a modern heresy, that a wisdom built on murdering all your love isn't wisdom at all. It's just a very disciplined way of being alone, and that a man who feels nothing hasn't transcended the world, he's just left it early. I told him a small parable about a beggar who abandoned everyone who loved him for a comfortable seat and called it freedom, and I watched a lifetime of certainty crack behind the old saint's eyes. He'd never once, in all his centuries, let himself wonder whether the master who'd set him on the ruthless path had simply been wrong. And that heresy is what saved my drunken friend. When the moment came that the story demanded a sacrifice, the wine immortal fated to die buying the others their escape. That old drunk, who'd sat through my mountain argument nodding into his cup, chose the other road, the path of feeling, instead of the path of cutting away. And it turned out to be a road to the summit too, and he lived. In the tale I knew, he dies there. I saved a man the story had marked for death by teaching a mountain full of sages that it was allowed to care. But the moon cult master I couldn't save, and I've turned that one over a lot of nights. The plot needed him dead. Too many good endings hung on it. Even I don't get to keep everyone. At the climax, he lifted a 5-story steel ship into the air with nothing but cultivation and the buoyancy principle I taught him over noodles, proving to a jeering crowd that the impossible was only physics they hadn't learned yet. Then he summoned an ancient water demon out of the deep, and I trapped the beast in a mirror pocket and took its head off with a slammed portal. But the heroes I'd steered and strengthened were already closing on him, and the old wine immortal's flying sword found him, and he fell. So I did the only thing left. I knelt beside the dying villain of that world, and I put my palm to his chest, and for once, instead of taking something, I gave. I poured everything I had, the math, the physics, the chemistry, the whole true shape of how the universe actually works, 6 gigabytes of a modern education, straight into a lonely genius's mind in the last minute of his life, and he understood all of it. I watched the answers to every question he died wondering about land behind his eyes at once, and the cruelty went out of his face, and he said a thing I've never forgotten, that to hear the truth of the world in the morning and die that same evening was a fair trade, and that his only regret was not meeting me sooner because he'd have followed me anywhere I went. Then the smartest man in a world too small for him died knowing, at last, the real size of it. I don't cry easy. I got close over a sorcerer. I left that world having taken almost nothing and given more than I ever had anywhere. The proud daughter confessed she loved me as I was leaving, having realized it too late, and I told her gently no, because I meant it about not leaving wounds. And the vortex carried me home, where the Cold War I'd left simmering behind the walls of my father's base had, in my absence, finally come to a boil. I came home from the gentle world into an ambush of a different kind, not teeth, but words, which in a base full of frightened people are worse. It opened before I'd even reached the walls. Wang Wei had sent a killer after Ling Shu while I was away, a fluid, shapeless assassin who slipped past every guard and put a blade into my little girl in the dark, or tried to. You cannot cut snow. Her Logia body came apart into a swirl of flakes around the knife and closed again behind it, and the assassin got one short scream out before she finished him, and that was Wang Wei's first mistake of that homecoming. He'd taught my daughter exactly how afraid of me he'd become. The second mistake was cleverer, and it nearly worked. A hidden zombie had killed the base's guard captain the night before I arrived, one of Wang Wei's own counselors, a strong man, dead in his bed with no sign of the killer. And when I walked into the council hall, Wang Wei didn't rage or draw. He pointed at me, sorrowful, reasonable, in front of every person who mattered in Dalongshan, and he made his case. Look at him, he said. Look how fast he grew. A nobody, an ordinary boy left for dead 3 years ago, and now he stands here stronger than men who've clawed for their power since the first day. How? There's only one thing in this world that grows that fast. He let it hang. By devouring awakened, he vanishes for weeks and comes back stronger, and every time he's gone, our people die in the dark. I don't want to believe it, but I have a duty. He gestured to a counselor who could read minds. Let Sun Tao look into your thoughts, Zheng Jing. Clear your name. If you're a man, you'll have nothing to hide. It was beautiful, honestly. I could almost admire it. Because he'd found the one demand I could not meet. A telepath in my head would not find a zombie, but he would find 10 worlds, a palm that's a computer, a stolen god's blood, the whole impossible truth. And refusing looked exactly like guilt. No, I said, and I watched it land on my own people. I watched Heavy Bark shift his weight. I watched even the ones I'd handed power to hesitate, just for a second, because the accusation was clean and my refusal was ugly, and fear is the loudest voice in any room at the end of the world. For one bad moment, I was back behind the shutter, the useless air, watching men who'd eaten at my father's table decide I was expendable. Then a small cold hand slid into mine. Ling Shu, who couldn't speak, who understood everything, had come to stand beside me, and she gripped my hand and glared at the whole council like a cat daring the room to try something. And whatever the vote of the frightened was about to be, I stopped waiting for it. So the hall turned into a fight, and it was a harder one than it should have been, because Wang Wei hadn't stayed in power all those years by being weak. His whole body went to living steel when I came at him, hard enough to turn my first hockey-charged fist with only a grunt, and he wasn't alone. A counselor at his side had a gift that could reverse my own skills back at me, so my kick-away came home to my own chest once before I learned to stop telegraphing it. And the guard team my father had built poured into the hall on Wang Wei's shout of "Kill the zombie." 40 trained awakened between me and the man I wanted. I put the leopard on the guards and my snow daughter's blizzard on the counselor, and went through Wang Wei himself the hard way, Sharingan reading his steel body for the soft seams a steel body always has, and I had him. I actually had his throat under my hand, felt the metal start to give, and I could have killed him right there. I wanted to. But not in that swarm. Not with a mind reader and a skill reverser and 40 loyal blades between me and a clean finish, and a botched revenge is just a warning you hand your enemy for free. So I didn't. I tore every scrap of metal in that hall into a screaming tornado, and I opened a door in the air and I stepped through it with Ling Shu and the leopard and vanished from a sealed room full of my enemies. I'll be back, I told the empty space where I'd been, loud enough for all of them to hear it. The chair is my father's. I'll be back for it. I left my oldest friends behind on purpose. Lin Ruoxi and her crew stayed, smiling and loyal and lying, my eyes on the inside while the tyrant thought he'd won. I hid out in the ruins of the dead city, scouted the thinking zombies' tower, sharpened myself against the horde, and waited for the frost to finish. When it did, Ling Shu was out hunting, and I couldn't reach her in time, and I did the hardest small thing of that whole stretch. I left her a note, 2 words, wait for me. And I let the vortex take me alone, with only the leopard, to a world of ninjas, not knowing it would be the last time I'd see her safe for a long, frightening while. The ninja world is where I got the powers that win the rest of this story, so pay attention, because almost everything you're going to watch me do to a squad of alien war gods, I stole on this one plane. I arrived in the middle of the worst night that world ever had. I came out of the vortex 20 feet up over a burning village and dropped onto the carved stone face of a mountain. And the first thing I saw was a fox the size of a skyscraper, 9 tails lashing, an avalanche of red hate on 4 legs, leveling a city block with every step. The second thing I saw was a man in an orange spiral mask standing perfectly still in all that chaos, one hand raised, and the air around his hand was bending the exact way my vortex bends the air, folding, phasing, space itself going soft. For once, I'd landed somewhere that spoke my native language. And the third thing I saw was a young man with a shock of yellow hair moving faster than the eye between the fox and the masked man, about to lose everything. The masked one turned his head and looked at me, one red eye through the mask, the tomo spinning, and I felt him try to read me and fail and go still with the specific stillness of a predator that's just met something it doesn't have a category for. Good. I like being uncategorized. It's kept me alive across 10 worlds. So I kicked the fox. You've watched me do this to gods. A 9-tailed mountain of malice is only a bigger target. I planted kick away in the base of the thing's spine with everything a god's body could put behind it and punted the entire screaming disaster off the edge of the world into my mirror pocket, the folded space I'd learned from a sorcerer supreme, and for 4 blessed seconds the village stopped ending. The yellow-haired man landed beside me in a crouch, chest heaving, staring at the empty crater where a natural disaster had been standing. Where did it go? He said. Somewhere quiet, I said. It won't hold. Big things don't like my pocket. You've got maybe a minute. He didn't waste it asking who I was. That's how I knew he was the smart one. Tobarama, he said, sticking out a hand. The fastest man in the village, the 4th Hokage, introducing himself mid-apocalypse like we'd met at a dinner. If you help me put it down, I owe you. Anything in my power. 3 times over. I collect favors from powerful men the way I collect powers. I shook the fastest hand in the ninja world and banked all 3 wishes before the fox came back. It came back. The masked man tore it out of my pocket by main force, which impressed me. Almost nobody reaches into that pocket, and shoved it back into the world snarling, and then he did the thing that was supposed to end the night. He moved to seal the beast's hatred, to steer it into the newborn the way the story demanded, the sealing that in the tale I knew costs both parents their lives. In the version I remember, Tobarama and his wife die here, and their son grows up an orphan with a monster in his belly and a village that hates him for it. I rewrote it. While Tobarama held the fox with chains of light, I put a god's lightning into the beast from the side and a founder's strength fist into its jaw, and I bought the seconds Tobarama needed to do the sealing his way instead of the dying way. The whole beast folded down into the crying baby without the price. Both parents left standing in the wreckage, alive, holding a son who'd get to grow up loved. The old 3rd Hokage arrived at the end to find the disaster already over and a stranger standing in the ash beside the 4th, and that was that. I was the hero of the village's darkest night. Which, if you've been paying attention, is the single best position from which to rob a place completely blind. Everybody trusts the man who saved the baby, and this village was a treasure vault wearing headbands, bloodlines, forbidden techniques, whole libraries of the impossible, and I had a god's roomy body now, with space on the drives and a shopping list a mile long. I moved into a little house at the edge of the compound of the clan with the red eyes, the Uchiha, whose bloodline I wanted most of all, and I made 2 kinds of friend, and I want to walk you through the hall, because you'll want the receipts when you see it all used against a Decepticon. The first friend was a man in a green jumpsuit named Lee, the single most sincere human being I've met in any world, whose entire philosophy was to punch harder through pure feeling. He'd trained his body to open the 8 inner gates, forbidden valves in a person that flood you with impossible strength at the cost of cooking yourself alive from the inside. I wanted that. So I trained with him, day after brutal day, and while we sparred I copied it, the 8 gates, onto my skill drive, and paid him back for it because his method had been quietly wrecking his own body for years and I had internal energy cultivation that could heal the damage, which is how a mortified silver-haired jonin named Guy walked in on the two of us mid-treatment, me with my hands on a groaning, shirtless Lee, and drew precisely the wrong conclusion and left very quickly and never brought it up again. Warm village. Good people. When I opened 4 of those stolen gates in a private test, out behind my house where no one could see, my crystal count roared from the 500s to 980 in a single breath. I felt the wind of it flatten the grass for 10 meters. That's the boost you'll watch me use to knock a Decepticon flat with one punch. A green jumpsuited man's forbidden technique, tested in a backyard, paid for with cultivation and a very awkward misunderstanding. The second thing I did was shake the 4th Hokage's hand again, on a friendly pretext, and copy the basic ninja art straight off the fastest man alive, the transformation jutsu, the substitution, and most of all, the shadow clone, the technique that makes 100 solid copies of you out of thin air. Remember the shadow clones. They're how I steal a cube out from under a Decepticon's hand and how I drown an ancient monster in a flash mob of myself, and I planted one more seed while I had his hand. I described a technique to Tobarama, a blade of wind spun down to a screaming needlepoint, and let the smartest ninja alive puzzle over it. Because why store the crude version of a weapon when a genius will happily invent the perfect one for me to come back and copy later? He'd call it the Rasen Shuriken. It's the spinning wind scream you'll watch shred a battleship into a tornado. A father built it chasing a technique for his son, and I picked the son's pocket across time before the boy could walk. The man I was most careful with was the one who worshipped darkness and called it common sense. Hizashi, a bandaged old hawk who ran the village's secret dirty work division out of a basement everyone pretended not to know about. He invited me for tea and spent the whole cup testing my worldview like a man tapping a melon. The clan with the red eyes, he said, watching me. You live beside them. What do you make of them? Parasites, I said, because I'd read the story, and I knew what he wanted to hear, and I was in a shopping mood. Proud of blood they didn't earn. A village carries them until it can't. The old hawk smiled for the first time in what looked like years, and I watched him decide, then and there, that I was the successor he'd been waiting for. We agreed about human nature, Hizashi and I, the way two people who've each been betrayed agree, too fast and about the wrong things. I let him groom me because a man with his own secret army is a very useful man to be underestimated by, and because I already suspected he'd hand me the darkest job of my whole strange life, and I'd already, God help me, half decided to take it. A pale snake of a man came sniffing around my house not long after, drawn by my space warping the way a shark comes to blood. Kabuto. He wanted exactly one thing in all the world, to never, ever die, and I could smell it on him. So I let him discover a few drops of my god blood, and I watched immortality's hook go straight through his cheek. Your blood, he breathed, holding the vial to the light like a man in love. It doesn't age. The cellular structure. How? Cooperation, I said. You have techniques I find interesting. I have blood you find interesting. We're reasonable men. We were not reasonable men. He thought he was studying me. I copied his forbidden techniques off him one careful handshake at a time. I even made the trip out to his hidden laboratory, a horror of a place, all tanks and specimens and ambition, and let him run his tests on my god blood while I quietly walked out with his darkest working, the technique that drags the dead back up out of the ground to fight for the living. To keep him hungry and cooperative, I fed him things only I could know, fragments of his own future, a war still years off, the shape of a sun he hadn't yet made. He drank every drop of it, certain each secret was proof I'd hand him immortality next. Everyone always thinks they're studying me. It is the single most reliable fact of my life, and it has furnished my drives off the corpses of a dozen world's cleverest men. Hizashi made me a root operative, gave me a codename and a squad, and then handed me a mission that let me rewrite another tragedy. There's a moment in that world's history where a trap kills a good young leader named Nagato and breaks his best friend so badly the friend's eyes awaken into a god weapon of grief. I knew the date and the place. So I fed a warning to the great toad sage Hashirama, dressed up as one of my prophecies. Of course, the old Khan never dies, and Hashirama came and summoned the fourth to back him, and between us we broke the ambush before it could close. We saved the ones we could, not all of them. Some deaths that story wants, it takes anyway, no matter how fast you move, and I've learned to make peace with the ones I can't reach. But I bent the shape of it. and Hizashi was furious that I'd meddled outside his orders and told me through his teeth to stay close and grab the god weapon eyes if a chance ever opened. I nodded like a good soldier and filed it under things I would not be doing. The masked man from the Fox Knight came back for me, of course. He wanted to know what I was. He brought a partner, a black plant thing with no blood and no lifespan of its own, an agent of his that grew out of the ground and bound me in the dark. Which was a mistake on their part, because a thing that's touching me long enough to bind me is a thing I'm copying, and off that black creature I lifted the wood release, the legendary growth technique of the village's founder, the one that grows a whole forest out of bare dirt and hangs giants in the branches. That's the grove you'll watch swallow a Decepticon whole. And then the masked man tried to finish me the way he finishes everyone, by phasing me into his private folded dimension where he's untouchable and I'm not. And found out the hard way that a man who learned mirror space from a sorcerer supreme can open a door into anybody's private hell and stroll right back out of it. I turned his safe room into a place I could walk into at will. You could see it break something in him. The way it breaks all of them when the one trick that's never failed simply stops working on the stranger. And somewhere in that fight, opening my stolen gates past 1,000 crystal points for the first time, the last drive in me unlocked with a click I felt behind my eyes. The F drive, memories. The ability to take hold of a person and simply page through everything they've ever seen, every secret they've ever kept, like flipping a book. I could read anyone now, all the way down. Remember that too. There's a man back home whose memory I need even more than I need his death, and this ninja world, of all the strange places, is where I finally got the key that opens a human skull. I stayed in that village long enough to make it a home, which is a dangerous thing for a thief to do, and it produced some of the best small days I had in any world. Hizashi folded me into his secret division, Root, they called it, the village's buried knife, and put me on a squad with 2 other operatives who went by single sounds instead of names. One was a quiet woman with purple hair. The other was a hidden Uchiha with a magnet release bloodline, of all the luck, who took one look at the new recruit and decided to establish the pecking order with a fan of steel needles, which is the single worst opening move a person can make against me. I reversed his own needles in the air and hung them a finger from his eyes before he'd finished his throwing motion, and just like that I was team captain, and the magnet boy spent the rest of our time together being very polite to me. I trained with the green jumpsuit fanatic almost every day and watched him crack open a 5th gate and then a 6th, and I copied every valve as he earned it. And I trained my leopard, the ink-black monster cat I'd carried in from the apocalypse, like a ninja hound, because the village had a clan that fought alongside dogs, and I wanted the method. The problem is that a proud, third-tier apex predator, taught to heal and fetch and track by scent, does not stay dignified. My terrifying shadow leopard learned to flop over for belly scratches and chuff like a delighted husky, and a war beast that could take a bear apart in one lunge would come bounding across the training field when I whistled, and the hardened ninjas of that village never quite recovered from the sight. Neither did the leopard's self-respect. It was worth it. The best comedy of that world came out of a mistake. I'd been healing the jumpsuit man's hidden injuries with internal energy, and in the process taught him some cultivation theory, and his sincere, overachieving brain took the pressure point knowledge and independently reinvented the gentle fist, the sacred, secret, eyes-only fighting art of the village's proudest bloodline clan, the one with the pale, all-seeing eyes. He did it with no bloodline at all, just feeling and effort, and started throwing it around in the training yard. The pale-eyed clan came down on us like a thunderstorm. Their elders arrived at the administration building demanding to know how their 1,000-year secret had walked out the door, ready for a reckoning. So I taught them Tai Chi. I sat those furious ancient men down and explained, in my most serene off-world sage voice, the soft overcomes hard philosophy from my own dead planet, how yielding beats force, how a soft art rooted in a moving center is the true source of all their pressure point styles, how their bloodline was a shortcut but not the foundation. Modern world knowledge delivered as ancient cosmic wisdom, and it landed exactly the way it had landed on a lonely sorcerer over instant noodles a world before. The pale-eyed elders went from wanting my head to bowing and calling me a sage from beyond the stars. I keep discovering that the most powerful thing I carry isn't the lightning or the swords. It's a high school education deployed on people who've never met one. It talks kings out of killing me on a fairly regular basis. I sent the pale snake his samples and copied his forbidden arts. I gave the silver-haired Jonin a scroll of sword Tao to grow into. And I met one more child in that village who mattered, a young Uchiha named Kaido, gentle and gifted, the single kindest person in a clan I was quietly steering toward a cliff, and I invited him to dinner, and I liked him, and I filed away that if the worst came I'd try to spare that one. I didn't know yet how much I'd need that mercy, or how soon, because the clan with the red eyes was watching all of it, the outsider who'd saved the village, who caught secrets like fruit and handed them to the wrong people, who was too friendly with the old hawk who hated them, and their patience, which had never been much, was running out. The red-eyed clan never warmed to me, and I made that worse on purpose, and this is the world where honest gets hard, so I'll just tell it. The Uchiha had been the proudest family in the village, and my saving the place on the Fox Night had rubbed their fading shine right in their faces, and the village's quiet distrust of them was curdling towards something ugly. Then the pale snake, Kabuto, trying to expose me as the immortal he suspected, did me the biggest favor of the arc without meaning to. He knocked out a tiny Uchiha prodigy, a solemn 5-year-old named Akira, already carrying a one-tomo eye who'd been guarding his baby brother, and dumped the unconscious child on my doorstep to frame me and set the clan on me. I looked down at the sleeping boy on my step, and I did not panic. I picked him up gently, carried him inside, and copied his Sharingan bloodline right out of him. 13 gigabytes of the red eye, and then, over the next days, woke my own copy of it all the way up to a mature 3-tomo through the mental cultivation I'd been grinding since the Sword World. That eye is why I move like a yellow blur through the robot war. I see the strike a half-second before it lands, and my stolen speed does the rest. And having taken it, I use the theft as a knife. I let the clan believe I'd stolen their sacred secret. I let their pride do the rest. They came to my house in a delegation to buy it back. The secret of how to push the eye past 3-tomo to the fabled next stage. Grave men in high collars sitting in my little front room making offers. Name your price, their patriarch said. Jutsu. Territory. A Sharingan of your own, freely given. I laughed at them. I couldn't help it. You're offering a copier your techniques, I said. You're offering a man who owns metal a knife. You have nothing I can't already take, and you came to my house to remind me of it. I watched the pride go rigid in every face in the room. The secret you want costs an eye you love. Go home and think about whose. They attacked, of course. Proud cornered things always do, and I'd been waiting for it. I opened 4 gates and put my hands to the floor and grew a founder's forest right up through my own house. The legendary deep forest emergence, timber erupting through the roof and hanging grown men in the branches like fruit, and I spun up a screaming disk of wind in my palm, the technique their 4th Hokage had built for me without knowing it, and I did not have to use it because the sight of it stopped the fight cold. Half the village came running at the noise. Tobirama arrived, and the old hawk Hizashi right behind him, and Hizashi took one look at armed Uchiha in my ruined garden and seized the moment he'd wanted for years, stripped the clan of its command of the village police on the spot, in public, marginalized in an afternoon. I'd stoked the fire, he'd poured the oil, the clan slid another notch toward the cliff, and I told myself it was strategy. It got darker. The masked man, wearing the face of a long-dead legend now, moved in on the desperate clan and started whispering coup, and the cornered Uchiha made the one move a village never forgives. They reached outside the walls, invited enemy ninjas in from 2 rival villages to help them assassinate me in my home. I want to be clear that they came to kill me first. The night they came, I was ready. Sharingan and the vanishing step and a god's body turn an assassination into a very bad evening for the assassins, and Tobirama flashed in at the end to pull me out of the masked man's ceiling trap with that spinning wind blade, and the attackers scattered into the dark, leaving their intentions behind them like a confession. Because the moment they'd invited foreign killers through the gate, they'd stopped being a mistreated clan and become traitors in a time of war, and the old hawk had his justification at last. He came to me that night, and he gave me the order, in the flat voice men use for the things they've wanted to say for decades. End them. Tonight. Lead my division and end the clan. I did it. I'm not going to dress it up, and I'm not going to walk you through the inside of that night, because there are things a person shouldn't say out loud even to a friend, and that's one of them. A clan died because it cornered the wrong stranger, and I was the stranger, and I led the men who did it. I won't hide behind the treason or behind Hizashi's order. I was angry and I was strong, and those are the 2 ingredients of every atrocity that's ever been committed, and I had both in full that night. That's the part my voice goes flat for. That's the one I don't make a joke over, and I've made a joke over almost everything. But here's the part I'm not ashamed of, and it's the only part I'd keep. I spared 3 of them. The solemn 5-year-old, Akira, whose eye I'd copied, I couldn't put him down, and I didn't pretend it was tactics. His gentle friend Kaido, 8 years old, the kindest child in a cruel family, and a baby named Ren, asleep through the worst night of his family's history, who'd done nothing to anyone. I took the 2 older boys as my own disciples and spent one of my 3 banked wishes to keep them safe from Hizashi, and I spent the weeks I had left teaching them the cultivation and the philosophy I'd carried across 7 worlds, and I watched 2 survivors of a thing I'd done choose to grow up kind anyway. It didn't make me even. Nothing makes you even. You take the small mercies you can still reach, and you carry the rest. I left that world with red eyes and a founder's forest and a father's wind blade and 100 shadow selves and a mind-reading key. More raw power out of one plane than I'd taken from any world before or since, and carrying, folded next to a dead friend's red dress, one more thing I don't set down. The frost finished. The vortex opened, and it took me home, to a base at war and a chair that was finally close enough to take. I came home the last time as a thing the apocalypse had no answer for. A god's body, a founder's forest, a mind-reading eye, red Sharingan, 100 shadow selves, lightning in my hand. I stepped out of the vortex into the dead city, and a third-tier zombie that would have ended my whole squad 3 years ago lunged at me, and I killed it without breaking stride or looking at it. That's the measure of the distance. That's what 10 worlds buys. But the first thing I felt, standing in that ruin at the height of my power, wasn't triumph. It was dread, because there was a note waiting on the floor of our hideout in Ling Shu's careful child's hand. And it said she'd gone out hunting and would be back, and she never had been. So I went to get her, and I finally learned what she was. The trail led back to the Jiayin building, the thinking zombies tower, the trap that had killed Spark, the crisis I'd portaled out of a lifetime ago. I walked back into it as something new, and I found the commander at the top, and this time there was no fleeing. It was intelligent, that one, truly intelligent. It spoke in a cold, flat, borrowed voice, and named itself after an empress, and told me it remembered nothing of ever being human. It tried to trick me first, all reason and offers in that flat, dead voice, and when the trick failed, it tried to eat me. It had spent a year building the room for exactly this, a year turning the tower into a snare, and it sprang the whole thing at once, chained lesser zombies flooding up through the floors, and among them, the evolved ones, the third-tier horrors, a steel-hard tyrant type, and a burrowing plant-armed thing, and a bloated psychic that could feel me, even when I turned invisible, the same nightmare crew that had killed Spark here a lifetime ago. Once, that room would have been my grave. Now, it was an afternoon. I tore every chain in the building into a whirling wall of steel and cut the swarm down as it came. When the psychic reached for my mind, the red eye reached back and showed it something no mind survives, and it folded up screaming. When the plant thing burst from the floor the way its cousin had once taken Spark, I was already 3 steps gone on the vanishing step, and I took its reaching arm off and fed it a spinning disk of wind that unmade it. The tower that had beaten me and killed my friend came apart around me in about the time it takes to tell it, and at the end of it, I had the thinking zombie itself pinned and helpless under a founder's forest branch, its borrowed voice finally out of clever things to say, and when I asked it the only question I'd come with, "Where is my little girl?" the thing said something that stopped my blood. No human girl ever came here, it told me, but a zombie one did. Then the outsiders arrived and made it worse. 2 powerful awakened from Hero City, Wei Jin, and a cold woman named Sui Jiang, hundreds of points each, hunting a prophecy. Their seers had foreseen a zombie empress, born in this exact tower, who would one day rise and destroy their city. They'd come to kill it in the cradle, to burn out anything in that tower that so much as looked like an intelligent dead thing. And I stood there, in a tower, where an intelligent dead thing had told me a zombie little girl had come, and I felt the whole shape of the trap the universe had built for me close 1 notch tighter. Because if their prophecy was about what I was starting to fear it was about, then 200-point strangers with a holy mandate were hunting the one person in the world I'd carried sleeping between planets. I said nothing. You learn, out here, exactly when to say nothing. And while we put the thinking zombie down together, I took its head and its cores and its cold borrowed voice with it. They searched the tower and found what it had been keeping, a small figure chained in a dry bathtub, filthy and starved and alive. Ling Shu, my Ling Shu. And when she saw me and made a sound of pure joy and lunged to throw her arms around me, I flinched back before I could stop myself, because a horror had already assembled itself in my head out of a dozen small things I'd spent years refusing to add up. I checked, the way only I can. I put my palm to her and opened her up like I'd opened 1,000 others, and where a person's drive should have been, there were 4 of them corrupted, sealed, unreadable. Exactly, precisely, the same broken pattern I'd seen in every zombie I'd ever scanned. The evidence was total. And I sat there with it, the strongest man in that world, and did the thing the strongest man is never supposed to do, which was refuse to believe what I could plainly see. Because here's what didn't add up the other way. In all our years, this child had never once raised a hand against a living soul. She'd slept in my arms. She'd eaten a devil fruit to keep it from an enemy at 10 years old, because she'd watched me and wanted to be brave like me. Whatever the scan said, I knew her. And I have learned to trust the thing I know over the thing I can measure, because I've measured a lot of monsters who turned out kind and shaken a lot of heroes' hands that turned out cold. She showed me herself in the end, because she wanted me to stop being afraid of her more than she wanted to be safe. She reached out in front of me and took one of the thinking zombie's crystal cores, and she ate it, chose to, watching my face, and I understood all of it at once. Her gift is devouring. She can eat the power out of other dead things and make it her own. That blur of speed she'd had the day I saved her, the speed the guard team had been hunting a little girl through the ruins to destroy. She'd taken from a fast zombie that came before her. They'd known what she was on that first day in the forest. I hadn't wanted to. And when she swallowed the commander's core, something in her that had never worked before came online, and my mute little girl, who had not said one word in all our years together, looked up at me and spoke. "Brother," she said. The first word she ever said to me. My little girl, the one who smiled at me and nobody else, who I'd carried sleeping between worlds, was a zombie, not a monster. A zombie who thinks, who chooses, who never once in all our time together raised a hand to a living soul. She waited to see my face when I understood it, whether I'd flinch a second time, whether the one person who'd ever looked at her like she was worth keeping would put her down like the rest of the world wanted to. I put my hand on her head, and she squinted up at me, pleased, the way she always did. "I don't care what you are," I told her. "I've been to 10 worlds. Half the heroes were monsters, and half the monsters were kind. You're mine. That's the whole conversation." And I decided on the spot that anyone who had a problem with my zombie daughter could take it up with the man who juggles alien war gods, and to this day nobody has. The Hero City pair could keep their prophecy. If a zombie empress was fated to be born in that tower, then the one I was walking out of it with was going to grow up loved instead, and we'd see whose prophecy held. That was the gentle reckoning, the one that ended in a word I'd waited years to hear. There was one more waiting for me back at the base, and it had teeth, and it was the whole reason I'd survived the shudder 3 years before. Wang Wei was still in my father's chair. He'd spent years telling the base I was dead, or a traitor, or lately, when my impossible growth got too loud to ignore, that I was some kind of hidden monster wearing a man's face. He wasn't entirely wrong about the monster part, which is the joke, but he meant it as an accusation, and I'd earned it as a resume. And I let him talk. For 3 years, I'd let him talk. This time, I walked into his hall, invisible, unfelt, standing at his shoulder while he held court, and there was no dodging, no metal tornado exit. No, I'll be back. This time, I was past 1,000 points, and he was 400, and his famous steel body might as well have been made of the same soft stuff as every person he'd ever stepped on to reach that seat. I let him see me before I touched him. I wanted him to have the second, the one where the ghost he'd sealed behind a shutter 3 years ago shimmers into the air beside his throne, grown into something out of a nightmare, and he understands with his whole body that the arithmetic has finally come due. To his credit, he didn't beg. He'd built his whole life on reading which way power was about to break, and he read this one correctly, and I watched him decide in half a second to stop pretending. "It was always going to be you," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "Your father had that same look. The one that doesn't blink." He straightened in the chair that wasn't his. "Go on then. You think the seat's any softer once you've killed for it? You'll learn." "Maybe," I said. "But I'm not here for the seat. I told you that on my way out, and you built a wall to keep me from coming back for it, and the wall's the reason I know you knew. A man doesn't fortify against a lie." I stepped close. "I'm here for a different thing, and you're going to give it to me before you go, and you're not even going to know that you did." Then I took him by the throat. His skin was supposed to be unbreakable. It bent in my hand like wet clay. And before I finished it, I put my palm to him and opened the drive I'd crossed 10 worlds and unlocked a god's memory eye to read, because there was one thing I'd wanted for 5 years, even more than I'd wanted his death, and it was the truth. I got it. All of it. Straight out of his own head, in his own memory. No way to lie to me in there. My father didn't die on that hunt because the beast was too strong. My father was hunting a great venomous serpent with a party of the base's best, everyone's eyes forward on the monster in front of them, and Wang Wei had kept a small venomous thing of his own, a third-tier snake coiled and quiet on his own wrist like a bracelet, and in the middle of the fight, with every gaze locked on the threat ahead, he set his little pet loose on the men beside him. He didn't lose my father to the apocalypse. He murdered him in the noise and the chaos and let the apocalypse take the blame. And then he walked home wearing grief like a good coat and sat down in the empty chair. And later, when the grief coat was old and the ordinary sun had grown into a loose thread, he reached out one more time, for me, with a supply run and some quiet orders and a shutter. I don't have a clever line for that part. I've made jokes across this whole story, before every fight and after every win, because that's how I keep the dark from getting in. But there's a rule I hold to, one my voice goes flat for. You don't make a joke over the thing that actually hurt. My father built a home for strangers at the end of the world, and a small man poisoned him for a chair, and let a boy think for 3 years that the world had simply taken his father the way it takes everyone. I closed my hand. Wang Wei's unbreakable neck did not save him, and a debt 3 years old, the one I'd carried across 10 worlds while I got strong enough to collect it, finally, quietly, balanced. I walked back into the council hall that my father built, and I sat down in his chair, and nobody said a word against it. There was nothing left to say it with. I had a monster leopard at one shoulder and a zombie daughter at the other and a head full of stolen gods, and the base that had thrown me out to die 3 years earlier was, at last, mine, not taken, come home to. Elder Zhang, the one-armed old man who'd never stopped being loyal to my father's memory, came up to the chair and looked at me sitting in it and simply wept because he'd waited 3 years to see the right man in the wrong seat put right, and I let him, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and that was the moment it actually felt like home instead of like a debt paid. I freed the last of Wang Wei's prisoners and pardoned the men who'd only followed him out of fear because my father would have. Then I did the thing that turned a base into something more. I opened my hands and gave my secret away. I called in the ones I trusted, and I told them the truth, that I was a man who could copy any power he touched and paste it into anyone he chose, and I started handing it out. Hockey to the big loud gunman, who I told to keep it quiet and who immediately told the entire base within the hour, beaming, the worst secret keeper the apocalypse ever produced. Cultivation to the quiet fire thrower, real technique to Lin Ruoxi and the crew who'd stayed loyal on the inside while I was exiled. I stopped building a faction and started building a nation, and I laid out the thing I'd wanted since the first day I understood what my palm could do. Permanent doors, real ones, portals anchored between our walls, and hero cities 100 miles off, an apocalypse finally stitched back together into somewhere a person could live instead of merely survive. I put good people in the empty council seats, the ones who'd stayed loyal, the ones who could build instead of just fight, and I set Guolei to walking the deep ground under the base until the burrowing thing that had murdered our people in their beds finally ran out of dark to hide in. For the first time since the dead stood up, Dalongshan felt less like a bunker and more like a home with its lights coming back on. And Ling Shu was home, and safe, and mine, and nobody in that base was ever going to hunt a little girl through the ruins again while I sat in that chair. I'd started this whole story as a nobody sealed behind a shutter to die, 5 points on a stranger's detector, swinging a laptop at a corpse in the dark. I ended it as the chief of the place that sealed the shutter, with a god's blood in my veins, a legendary sword in my hand, a monster cat and a snow daughter at my shoulders, and the memory of 10 worlds packed behind my eyes. The heir they threw away had come home the hard way, the long way, one stolen world at a time. I could have stayed, built the walls higher, dug the permanent doors, grown old as a chief the way my father never got to. That was the plan. That's always the plan. But the pattern on my palm doesn't care about my plans. It finished its slow drawing while I was still learning how to sit in that chair, and the vortex came for me one more time, and threw me, with all my stolen gods and all my hard-won peace, straight down out of the sky into a strange new world, straight into plane number 9. The first thing I saw in the new world was a 30-foot war machine punting a battle tank across a parking lot like it was an empty soda can. The tank hit a barracks, went through the barracks, and kept going. Somewhere behind me, a very brave and very doomed soldier was emptying an automatic rifle into the machine's ankle, which was doing roughly as much damage as spitting on a bulldozer. And me? I was standing in the open, still tasting the copper burn of a wormhole in the back of my throat, watching a United States military base get folded in half by something that should not exist. I hadn't even unpacked. 9 worlds in, 5 years on the road, and the vortex had finally dropped me somewhere that, at first glance, looked like it had nothing worth stealing. No magic, no bloodlines, no ancient sword arts. Just soldiers, steel, and one very large problem folding a base in half. The pattern on my palm was blank. Fresh arrival. I had half a year here, and I was already bored of watching. So I raised my hands, slammed them together, and let the earth answer. Branches erupted out of the parking lot. Not little garden variety vines, trees, thick as pillars, dozens of them, whipping up around the machine and dragging it down by the joints. Wood release. I copied it off a man who could grow forests out of his fingertips, and against a single giant it works like a father sitting on a toddler. Total, unfair, comprehensive smothering. The machine, later I'd learn its name was Cyclone, which is a lot of name for something I was currently gift wrapping in oak, thrashed and screamed metal, and for about 4 glorious seconds I thought, well, that was easy. Then a second monster dropped out of nowhere and sawed my forest in half. Blades came out of its arms like a hardware store having a nervous breakdown, and every vine I'd grown fell in neat little segments. 2 of them now. Cyclone and its friend, Stinger, took one good look at me, made the correct decision, and ran. That was new. Things usually don't run. I let them. See, one of these overgrown appliances, I could bully all day. 2 at once, working together, and suddenly it's a real fight and I'm not showing off, I'm working. Chasing them into the dark with no idea what else was out there struck me as the kind of decision that gets a man turned into a hood ornament. So I stood in the wreckage of a base I hadn't been in for 5 whole minutes, dusted off my hands, and did the math. The math was simple. This whole plane had exactly one thing worth stealing. The soldiers didn't know that yet. What the soldiers knew was that a young man had walked out of a rip in reality, sprouted a forest, and scared off the two demons that had been about to erase them all. So when the shooting stopped and the dust settled, every gun on that base slowly, nervously, swung around to point at the scariest thing left standing, which was me. Naturally. The base commander. I could tell he was the commander because he was the one sweating through his collar while pretending not to, cleared his throat and asked the question they were all thinking. Who, he said, exactly, are you? Now, I want to be honest about my character here. A better man would have explained calmly that he was a peaceful interdimensional traveler and asked for directions to the nearest thing worth robbing. I looked at 300 armed, terrified Americans who had just watched me perform a miracle, and a genuinely wicked idea crawled up out of the back of my brain and made itself at home. Me? I said. You can call me Earthling if you like, but that's not quite right. I let it hang. I let the silence do some work. Where I'm from, you'd call me a messenger of God. Beat. An angel. Dead quiet. The commander's face did something complicated. You could see the scientist in him fighting the churchgoer in him and losing, because here's the thing about the United States. They'll tell you all day it's a country of reason and rockets and men who believe only what they can measure. And then something with wings shows up and half of them are on their knees before you finish the sentence. I hadn't even shown them the wings yet, so I showed them the wings. One-hand seal, transformation jutsu, the most basic trick in a ninja's whole kit, the sort of thing they teach 12-year-olds, and a puff of white smoke rolled off me. When it cleared, I was bathed in soft, milky light, and rising off my back, slow and enormous and glowing, was a pair of pure white feathered wings. I did not look like an angel who wanted to keep a low profile. I looked like an angel who had rented a billboard. They dropped. Half the base went straight to their knees, praying, and the other half just stood there with their jaws unhinged, and the commander whispered, "It really is an angel," in the voice of a man watching his entire understanding of the universe file for divorce. I held the pose exactly long enough to sell it, then let the jutsu go and stood there in my regular, unremarkable face and said with tremendous modesty, "The wings draw attention. I prefer to walk among you like this." The commander's lips twitched. "You were being flamboyant on purpose just now, weren't you?" Smart man. I liked him. Didn't matter. "God sent me," I told him, "to help you fight those monsters." Which was technically a lie stacked on a lie stacked on the single true thing, that I did in fact plan to deal with the monsters right after I stole the treasure they were all fighting over. But you don't lead with that part. There was one soldier who didn't kneel and didn't gape. Captain Miller, I'd get his name in a minute, just stood there frowning at me like a man trying to remember where he'd left his keys. He'd end up in the room with me later, and he'd be the one to ask the honest question. But that's a few scenes away. For now, the base commander got on the phone to a building called the Pentagon, and I got shown to the nicest room they had, and I lay back on an actual mattress for the first time in what my body swore was years, and I thought about the one thing on this whole plane worth all this theater, the Allspark. Let me tell you about the Allspark, because it's the reason I was about to ruin the government of the most powerful country on this earth. The Allspark is a cube, a big one. Picture a skyscraper that decided to become geometry, and it is packed, wall to wall, with more raw energy than this planet has a word for. Its favorite trick is turning anything electrical into a living machine. Phone, rice cooker, television, plug it in, wave the cube at it, and congratulations, your microwave is now a person with opinions. That kind of power doesn't come around every plane. That was my souvenir. That was the thing I was leaving with. Only one problem. It was sitting in a secret vault owned by these very same soldiers who currently thought I was an angel. And getting it out was going to require me to be a lot less angelic. But that's tomorrow's crime. Tonight, the base commander was on the phone to the Pentagon, and I would have paid real money to hear that call. I didn't have to pay. I heard about it later, and it went about how you'd expect. The Pentagon operator picks up, all business, and the commander says, calm as a man reporting a parking violation, that two enormous robots just attacked his base with enough firepower to level it, and that the situation is handled because God sent an angel down to drive them off. Long pause on the line. The operator covers the phone, leans over to the guy at the next desk, and asks, I promise this is real. Hey, is today April Fool's? It was not April Fool's. It took the poor man 3 separate confirmations and 1 small existential crisis before he passed it up the chain, and the chain, being the chain, decided the only sane response was to fly the angel to Washington and look at him in person. So the next morning, they put me on a military jet with Captain Miller, and we went to go meet the people who ran the country. Miller sat across from me the whole flight, not talking, staring at the wall like it owed him money. So I decided to talk to him because I was bored and because I'd already peaked. See, on the plane, I did something I'd been underusing for years. I've got 4 drives in my blood: genes, skills, knowledge, and memories. The memory drive I always figured was junk. Read-only, useless, a filing cabinet of stuff I already knew. But that flight, I cracked open the 8 gates in my body long enough to boost myself, opened the memory drive, and dug up something specific. My own memory of watching the Transformers movie, years ago, back before any of this. And I watched it again, inside my own head, in HD. Turns out the junk drive is the best drive I own. Every plane I land in, I've half forgotten the plot of. But if I can pull up the memory and rewatch it, I walk in knowing exactly what happens next. That's not a filing cabinet. That's a cheat sheet for reality. And the movie told me all about Captain Miller. So I looked at the man staring at the wall and I asked gently, "How long since you've been home to see your kid?" His head came up like I'd slapped him. "I never told you I had a family." "I'm an angel." I shrugged. "We know things." He studied me. Then, quieter, testing. "Boy or girl? How old?" "Little girl. About a year." I thought about the scene in the movie, the soldier who could only hold his baby through a video screen from the other side of the world. She's probably not walking yet. Something went soft and terrible in his face, the look of a man who hadn't held his daughter in months and had just been reminded by a stranger from the sky. And I want to be clear, I was running a con on his entire government and I felt bad about exactly one thing on this whole plane, and it was that look. Being a soldier is a rotten deal. Nobody leaves home and misses their kids' first steps because they want to. They do it because somebody has to, and it happened to be them. He asked me what heaven was like. I opened my mouth to make something up. And the pilot said we were landing. The Pentagon did not believe in angels. The Secretary of Defense in particular did not believe in angels. This was a man with a desk the size of a dining table and not one single living green thing on it. He'd built his whole self around the idea that the world was made of measurable, explainable stuff, and that God was a story people told each other to feel better. He looked at me the way you'd look at a street magician who wandered into a bank, polite, bored, already deciding I was a trick. "No matter how impressive you are," he told me, "you're just good at magic. If you'd like to leave, there's the door." I looked at his enormous, spotless, plant-free desk. "You work too hard," I said. "You should keep something green in here." He blinked at me, and while he was blinking, I pressed my palms together. A crack ran up the middle of his desk, and out of the crack came a branch, and the branch became a sapling, half a meter tall, green leaves shivering with life, growing out of solid mahogany in the time it takes to say so. The Secretary of Defense shot to his feet so fast his chair went over. That's a trick," he said to the small tree now living on his desk. He said it the way you say something you need to be true. "I don't know how you did it, but it's a trick." Stubborn. I could respect stubborn, but I was on a schedule. "You think it's a trick," I said. "Then you should really go to that base and see the damage yourself." He gave me the speech about how busy he was, how the trip would take days, how a man of his importance couldn't possibly. I stopped listening and drew a circle in the air with my finger. Fire sparks bloomed out of nothing, spun themselves into a ring the size of a doorway, and through the ring, clear as a window, was the base. The actual base. 1,000 miles away, right there, one step through. "Now," I said. "Is it still too far?" I walked through. He followed me. He had to. His whole worldview was hanging by the thread of me being a fraud, and here I was, standing in his miracle, daring him to touch it. He stepped through the ring into a plaza on the far side of the country, turned around, and saw his own office through the far side of the hole. And I watched a lifetime of careful, measured, reasonable certainty quietly walk out of the man's eyes. "It's not possible," he whispered. "There can't really be a God. There can't really be an angel." I didn't correct him. Whether I was an angel had stopped being the point. The point was that I could stand in his office and be at his base in a single step, and there was nothing he or his army could do about it. That fact was going to keep him up at night. I was counting on it. What I didn't count on, not yet, was that the man above him, the man in the White House at the top of it all, was already deciding that a person who could go anywhere, anytime, through any wall, was not an asset to recruit. He was a problem to be caught. Here is what I've learned about power in 5 years of visiting other people's worlds. The small men want to work with you. The powerful men want to own you. And the most powerful man in any room has already decided, before you finish shaking his hand, that a thing he cannot control is a thing that has to be destroyed. The President of the United States never once considered cooperating with me. Why would he? Cooperation is what you offer an equal. And in his head there was no equal. There was the United States, and there was one strange man, and one man is always, always smaller than a country. He'd already tasted what one frozen alien robot did for his nation's technology. Imagine what he could learn by cutting open an angel. That was the whole of his thinking. Catch it, open it, keep the secrets. So when the invitation came, the president himself, they said, wants to meet you tomorrow at a place called Hoover Dam. I knew exactly what it was, and I went anyway, because Hoover Dam wasn't just a dam. Buried inside it was a secret department the movies had shown me, and in that department, under the concrete and the water, sat two things I'd crossed a whole plane for: a frozen robot the size of a building, and the Allspark. A colonel met my plane, very polite, very crisp, walked me down through the dam, opened a heavy door, said please go in, and the moment I stepped through, the door slammed and the room lit up blue. 5,000 volts. I want to be fair to them. It was a good plan. That much current would drop a bull. It dropped me. My body's been rebuilt with the blood of a thunder god, and it still lit up like a cheap sign, every muscle locking, the world going white and then going nowhere at all. I woke up strapped to a chair built out of steel and bad intentions, wrapped in coils, and a calm voice told me that if I so much as flexed, the chair would give me another 5,000 volts to think about. A screen came on, and there he was, the president, safe in his White House 1,000 miles away, looking at me the way you look at a lab sample. No hello. We ran your name. We ran your DNA. There is not one record of you anywhere on Earth. So, who are you? Where are you from? You took my DNA, I said. My face was doing a thing I don't let it do often. A syringe broke on your skin, he said, almost admiring. You're tough. But now I ask, and you answer. You don't get to ask. Answer, or the colonel turns the dial. I looked at the little camera. So you think you've got me cornered? It seems I do. Here's the thing they never understand, the ones who catch you in a trap. The trap only works if you're actually in it. And a cage made of steel, to me, is a cage made of the one substance in this world I can pick up and fold with my mind. The colonel reached for the dial. The remote in his hand exploded. The chair unwound itself around me like a snake losing a fight, and I stood up out of it and stretched. You built me a chair out of metal, I said, and then you were surprised when metal did what I told it to. That's a lot of ambition for people who understand nothing about the thing they caught. The colonel drew his pistol and put 2 rounds into me, shoulder and thigh, except the bullet stopped a hand's width from my skin and hung there in the air, spinning quietly. He stared at them. Then he threw the gun away and came at me with his fists, which was, honestly, brave. Here, I said, and flicked one finger. One of the bullets floating in front of me snapped forward and put a neat red hole between his eyes. He was dead before his knees got the message. On the screen, the president had stood up. His mouth was open. The confident man who ran the world had just watched his ambush turn inside out in about 9 seconds, and his face was coming apart at the seams. I stepped close to the camera so he could see me clearly, so he'd have it to remember on the nights that were coming. Mr. President, I said, I want you to understand how stupid it was, not to kill me, but to try and keep me. You had one move, and you played the wrong one. I let him sit in it. So wait for me. I'm going to come to the White House personally and find you. I snapped my fingers at the little camera the way you'd flick off a light. The screen went black, and the great sorrow, the great fury, went quiet in me, the way the loudest things do. I've noticed that about myself. The angrier I am, the calmer I look. There's a sword I carry, a peerless thing, thin as a whisper, and it lifted off my back on its own and began to turn, slow circles around me, as if it could feel the temperature drop. Then I opened the door and went to go take apart their secret world one hallway at a time. They tried to stop me. I'll give them that. They tried everything. Out in the hall, a dozen soldiers had their rifles up. I lifted a hand and the rifles tore themselves out of their grips, flew into the air, and crushed together into a single ugly ball of scrap, like a fist closing. They pulled their combat knives. Good instinct. Knives don't have a metal a magnet man can grab, except of course they were also metal, and up they went, and the ball in the air got a little bigger and a little uglier. Then they came with their fists, and I grew a forest out of the floor and left them hanging in the branches like the world's angriest fruit. A blast door slammed shut in my face to seal me in. My sword cut a doorway through it. Men with rocket launchers fired down the corridor. I curled a finger and the rocket stopped, turned around, and went home. Everything in that place was built out of steel and fear, and I own steel, and fear has never once slowed me down. The head of the whole secret department backed away from me down a corridor, emptying a pistol into the space where the bullet simply stopped and hung. You're a devil, he kept saying. You're a devil. I'm a devil, I agreed, and lifted him off his feet by the collar. And so is almost everyone I've met on this earth. Your greed genuinely impresses me. Now, where are Galvatron and the Allspark? I'll never tell you. That's fine. I set him against the wall, not gently. I already know. Because I didn't need his mouth. I needed his memory drive, and I'd read it the moment I touched his collar. There are no secrets from a man who can plug into your head like a thumb drive. And then I walked into the vault, and got my first look at the thing I'd come all this way to steal, and stopped dead. The Allspark was a cube 100 meters to a side. 1,000,000 cubic meters of it. I've bragged in my time about lifting mountains. I could not so much as budge this. It sat in that vault like a small building that had gotten lost, and the horrible truth landed on me all at once. I'd crossed a plane for a treasure I physically could not carry out the door. There was exactly one way to shrink it down to something a man could pocket, and it was to make a transformer do it. And the only transformer handy was the one thawing out of a block of ice 40 meters away, because I'd been so thorough in wrecking their power systems that I'd knocked out the freezer keeping the leader of the bad guys asleep. His name was Galvatron. He opened 2 red eyes like a pair of murder lamps, stepped on the scientists who'd been keeping him frozen without breaking stride, felt the Allspark's pull, turned himself into a spaceship, and came howling into the vault to claim his birthright, at which point he found a very small human standing between him and it. "Excuse me," I said, "but the Allspark's mine now." He looked down at me the way a boot looks at a bug and told me I was brave and stupid, mostly stupid, and raised 1 foot the size of a car to make a stain out of me. I grew a tree under his foot and let it carry the foot up to the ceiling. While he was busy being confused about that, I opened 3 of the 8 gates in my body, my blood going white hot, my eyes bleeding into the red spin of the Sharingan, dropped a gauntlet of the hardest metal in any world over my fist, and put everything into 1 punch to the chest. 10 tons of War God staggered, nearly went over, from 1 punch, from something the size of his thumb. "Impossible," he breathed. "How can a human?" He never finished a sentence around me. Nobody does. I was already too fast for him, flickering out of every grab like a fly he couldn't swat, and while he swung at empty air, I opened the 4th gate, and the wind in the room began to scream, and I gathered it into my palm and compressed it down into a shrieking little disc of pure edge. 1,000 wind blades spinning in a circle the size of a dinner plate. I pressed it into his arm and let it open. Rasen Shuriken. The last technique of a ninja world, and it does not care how big you are. It carved a canyon into his steel, and then detonated into a storm that peeled hundreds of cuts across his body all at once. I took a breath and started building a second one. Galvatron, the leader of the Decepticons, the biggest thing on this plane, a creature that had been ruling nightmares before humans invented fire, looked at the second disc forming in my hand and did the smartest thing he'd done all day. He turned into a spaceship and ran. I let him go too, not because I wanted to, because the Allspark was still 100 meters wide and I still couldn't carry it, and one running Galvatron was a problem for later. I left 2 shadow clones of myself sitting cross-legged under the cube to guard it. If anyone so much as touched the thing, the clones would pop and flash their memories straight back to me. I stitched a ceiling barrier over the vault door. Then I went to find the one transformer in this whole world who could shrink my treasure for me and might actually be talked into helping. His name was Hot Rod. And to find him, I had to go shopping on the internet. The movie in my memory drive told me the Autobots would come looking for a teenager named Jake, because Jake had a pair of old glasses with a map to the Allspark scratched into the lens, and it told me exactly how to find Jake. He was selling those glasses online on a secondhand website under a username to raise money for a car. So I found a family with a computer, gently convinced them with an illusion that they very much wanted a nap, logged onto the website, and bought everything the kid was selling. Then I flew across the country by turning myself into a piece of carry-on luggage and riding in an overhead bin, because I don't have an ID in this world, and I am, at heart, a cheapskate. Jake turned out to be a jittery, sweaty, deeply broke young man whose entire personality was, needs a car to impress a girl. He laid his junk out on the coffee shop table 1 piece at a time, narrating each like a shopping channel host, and when I said I'd take all of it, he nearly levitated. 20% off, he blurted. $20,000 for everything. The real price was $5,000. I knew this because I'd read the movie, but I didn't care about the glasses. I could already see the map. I had the Allspark's address memorized. What I cared about was that somewhere nearby, a yellow car was watching me. I told Jake I'd rather buy him an actual car than hand over cash, and walked him to a dealership, and while he circled a convertible he couldn't afford with his tongue practically on the floor, I felt it, that specific weight of being watched. I turned, and there it was, a yellow Camaro, parked across the lot, angled just slightly toward me, the way a person leans when they're pretending not to stare. "Go try that one," I told Jake. "Open the door, get in." He would not. He was suddenly, loudly convinced I was a car thief using him as a patsy, and honestly, the boy had good instincts and terrible timing. So I looked at him with the red spin in my eyes and quietly borrowed his free will for a minute and made him walk over and pull the handle. It didn't open, locked tight. So I reached past him and pulled the handle myself, and it popped open like it had been waiting for me. That told me everything. The car wasn't after Jake. The car had figured out that I was the one holding the glasses now. I gave the kid all the cash in my pockets, wished him luck with his convertible and his imaginary girlfriend, slid into the driver's seat, and drove off the lot. Ding! Removable storage device detected. That little message lit up in the back of my skull the second I sat down, the same prompt I get whenever I touch anything with a soul and a hard drive. Regular cars don't say hello. This one did. I patted the wheel and drove us out to a quiet hill. All right, I said. No one here but us. Tell me what you wanted to see me about. Silence. Then a crackle from the radio and a strange stitched-together voice made of chopped-up song lyrics and old broadcasts because, I'd learn, somebody had wrecked this one's voice box a long time ago and he'd been talking through the radio dial ever since. Do you, the radio said in 3 different singers' voices, know who I am? Autobot, from Cybertron. I kept my hands on the wheel. I know more than you'd think. He couldn't help himself. The car folded up and unfolded and stood up, a tower of yellow steel out on that empty hill. Even after a dozen of these, the transformation still got me every time. Something the size of a go-kart becomes something the size of a house, mass appearing out of nowhere, physics quietly excusing itself from the room. His name was Hot Rod, and he lowered his big metal face down to mine and asked, nervous and hopeful, whether I'd bought the glasses because I knew what they did. I took the glasses out of my pocket. His eyes lit up. Then I closed my fist and turned them to powder and let it fall between my fingers. The radio made a sound like a cartoon character stepping on a rake. You little rascal, it managed in a cheerful jingle, while his whole body language screamed betrayal. Relax, I said. You only wanted the glasses to find the Allspark. I already know where the Allspark is, so the glasses were a receipt for a thing I've already got. I watched that land. There's a complication, though. The bad guys know where it is, too. Galvatron was standing right next to it. I chased him off. Hot Rod went very still, the way a machine goes still when it's processing something it doesn't want to believe. Not the part about Galvatron, the part where I said I chased him off, alone. While Hot Rod was still deciding whether to believe me, my 2 shadow clones under the Allspark popped like soap bubbles and dumped their memories into my head, and the memories said, "Company's here." Galvatron hadn't run home to sulk. He'd run home to get his friends. 7, 8 of them now, pouring back into that vault under the dam. Thundercracker, Cyclone, the whole ugly family, and Galvatron himself out front, punching through my ceiling barrier to get at the cube. I teleported in with Hot Rod at my back and walked into a room with a 9-to-1 problem in it. Let me tell you how you steal a treasure you can't lift, out of a room full of things that can each throw a tank. You cheat, obviously. First I made the room believe I was weak. Thundercracker had already blown up one of my clones earlier and decided I was nothing, so when I flooded the vault with 100 shadow clones, all of them shouting and charging like the world's angriest flash mob, the Decepticons relaxed. Look how easy, they thought, cutting my clones down 2 and 3 at a time. Just a lot of noise, just a weak little man making copies. Meanwhile, Galvatron had his hands on the Allspark, and the Allspark was doing the one thing I needed it to do. Under a transformer's touch, it lit up like a circuit board and began to collapse, folding down, smaller and smaller, 100 meters, then a house, then a helmet, then something that fit in one giant palm. That was the entire plan. I needed him to shrink it for me. Thanks, big guy. I went invisible, walked through the middle of the whole shouting mess, and the instant the cube reached pocket size in Galvatron's hand, I flickered, one blink of speed, appeared standing in his open palm, grabbed the Allspark out from under his fingers, and was gone before his fist finished closing on nothing. Wu Yan! He'd learned my name. They always learn it right about the time it stops helping them. I dropped the cube into my storage space and ran for the exit, and here's where it got fun. Because a transformer in robot mode weighs 10 tons, and I can't move that. But a transformer that turns into a car is light, a jet is lighter. So when Cyclone changed into a helicopter to chase me, and Thundercracker changed into a jet, I simply reached out with a magnet's hand and made them ram each other in midair. A police car came at me. I picked it up and threw it into the other cars like a bowling ball. The most dangerous beings on the plane, the second they made themselves aerodynamic, became toys in a bathtub. It stopped being a battle and became a boy stepping on his own action figures. Galvatron couldn't even chase me properly. I'd taken his arm off earlier, so he couldn't fold down into his ship. He just stood in the wreckage watching me juggle his entire army, screaming at them to change back. Change back. You're no match for him like that. And by the time they figured it out, I'd scattered into a dozen more clones and vanished into the countryside. Nobody could tell which Running Man was the real one. The real one was already a mile away with a universe-grade battery in his pocket. I found a quiet place, and I fished the injured Hot Rod out of that vault with a teleport, and I waited, because I'd made a mess I couldn't clean alone, and it was time for the grown-ups to show up. They showed up after nightfall. Alpha Trion himself, and Perceptor, and Prowl, and Grimlock. The good guys, late but real. A proper heroic lineup rolling in to save a day that was, awkwardly, already over. Wait, Optimus said, when he'd heard the whole thing. You already fought the Decepticons, and you already have the Allspark. I held up my palm and let the little cube sit there in it, glowing. Prowl put his hand out for it immediately. Give it here. Let us protect it. It's Cybertron's treasure. No, I said and closed my hand. It's my spoils of war. I fought for it. I'm not handing it to anyone. There was a whole argument. There always is. It's ours. It belongs to our people. And I said, fine. Then where were you when Galvatron had his hands on it, and what will you trade me for it? And do you happen to have anything else in the universe worth as much as the single most valuable object in the universe? No? Then we don't have a deal. And it was Optimus, in the end, who cut it off. Not by threatening me, by being smarter than everyone in the room. Leave it with him, he told the others. He took it from Galvatron single-handedly. If he can take it, he can keep it. It's safer in his hands than in ours. Because that was the truth the Autobots didn't like to say out loud. They didn't need to own the Allspark. They just needed the Decepticons to never, ever have it. And I was, apparently, the best safe on the market. So we made a different deal. They'd help me learn how to actually use the thing. All that power, wasted if I couldn't turn it on. And I'd keep it out of the wrong hands. I took over a technology company with a look and a whisper, and Optimus and I got to work. I didn't know it yet, standing in that lab shaking a giant robot's finger, but that handshake was about to build me the best friend I'd make on this entire plane. And then get him killed. The next 6 months were, by my standards, a vacation. The Decepticons couldn't find me. The government had gotten quiet in the specific way governments get quiet when they're building something. And I spent my days in a lab with a giant red truck learning to pull energy out of the Allspark and, more interestingly, learning to build life with it. Because that's what the Allspark does. Point it at a machine and the machine wakes up. The trick, the part that took us half a year, is that the thing that wakes up isn't automatically on your side. Early attempts woke up screaming and swinging. What Optimus and I were really building was a way to wake one up sane, programmed, ours. 6 months in, on a bright morning, we finally had a candidate. A black off-road truck, sleek and mean, parked in the middle of the lab. Optimus was nervous. I was excited. Hot Rod, who was a menace, snuck up and lasered the Autobot logo onto its hood before we'd even switched it on, like signing a cast. Optimus laid a hand on it, poured in the light, and the truck woke up. It revved. It peeled out and did a couple of show-off donuts around the lab, like a kid who just discovered his own legs. Then it stopped and stood up and unfolded into a robot and clamped the truck's exhaust pipe between its teeth like a cigar and looked around at a room full of ancient, legendary Cybertronian warriors and said, "All right, listen up. I don't care how old you clowns are. From today, you all answer to me. I'm the boss." Dead silence in the lab. We had, after 6 months of the most delicate scientific work of 2 worlds, successfully created a gangster. "I think," Optimus said quietly, "we should start over." "Hey," said the gangster, offended, blowing a cloud of exhaust smoke. "That's no way to talk to your boss." Then its optics found me, the smallest thing in the room, the obvious mark, and it swaggered over. "You, little guy, let me show you how much respect the boss gets around here. Beat you, you're my errand boy for life. Deal?" "Deal," I said, "and if you lose, you're mine." It laughed and grabbed for me. I'd hit 850 crystal points by then, and with the Mind Stone amplifying my meditation, I could put a punch through steel like it was warm butter. I dropped the gauntlet on my fist and hit its open hand, and the newborn thug went end over end across 100 meters of lab and stuck in the far wall, exhaust pipe still improbably clamped in its teeth. Then I grew a tree up its back and hauled it into the air by the neck and the waist and the ankles. "So," I said, "you convinced?" "Boss," it howled instantly, all swagger gone. "You're the boss. I'm your little brother. Total respect. Always had it. Love this guy." I let it down. It scrambled up, dusted itself off, and immediately, I want you to understand the personality we had built here, immediately started figuring out how to use me. "Okay, boss, so from now on, you protect me, right? Anybody gives me trouble, I just say your name. What is your name, by the way? So I know what to yell." Most people hire a bodyguard to do their fighting. I had accidentally created a bodyguard who intended to use me as a human shield and a brand name. It was, against every instinct I have, completely charming. I named it Titan Grey. Partly because it was, in fact, large and black, and partly because back home I have a pet I call Large Shadow, and I have exactly this much imagination when it comes to names. Titan Grey hated the name for about 4 seconds, until I offered the alternative, Little Black, at which point it decided Titan Grey was a name of tremendous dignity, and it would be honored to carry it. And that was the bridge, in the end. Between me and these Autobots. Between me and this whole plane. Not the Allspark. This ridiculous chain-smoking coward who called me boss and meant it, who I taught swordsmanship to just so it would stop whining, who I quietly started planning to bring home with me across the worlds, because a man who travels alone gets tired of the quiet, and Titan Grey never once in its life shut up. I told myself it was practical. A robot that turns into a car, free transportation across every plane I'll ever visit. That's all it was. A tool. A mount. You already know that's a lie. I knew it too. I just didn't say it out loud, the way I don't say a lot of things out loud, because the moment you admit a thing is precious to you is the moment the universe writes down the address. And the universe, as always, was taking notes. Two things were moving in the dark while I taught a robot how to hold a sword. The first was Galvatron's real boss. It turns out Galvatron wasn't the top of the food chain. There was something older behind him, one of the original 13 Transformers, a creature that had been alive for tens of millions of years and had a name I'd eventually earn the hard way, the Fallen. And the Fallen wanted something even bigger than the Allspark. The Allspark, to him, was just a map. What it pointed to was a machine, hidden on this Earth since before humans had language, a machine built to reach up and switch off the sun and drink the energy as it died. That was the whole plan. Kill the star. Harvest the light. And once you've done that, it doesn't much matter what technology the little humans have, because the little humans are a rounding error on a dead rock. The second thing moving in the dark was the president, who had come up with a plan he thought was very clever. He made peace with Galvatron on live television. I watched it in the lab with the Autobots, all of us crowded around a screen like a family at the holidays, as the most powerful man in the country walked out onto the White House lawn and shook hands with a 30-foot war criminal in front of the entire planet. The Decepticons get to operate legally on American soil. In exchange, the Decepticons hand America a fire hose of alien technology for free with a smile. The crowd cheered. The commentators wept about a new age of mankind. Somewhere, a man who had personally watched Galvatron flatten a base was screaming at his television. Galvatron doesn't represent Cybertron, Prowl muttered. Galvatron doesn't do anything for free, said Perceptor. He's handing over his crown jewels. Nobody does that unless the crown jewels are bait. They were right, of course. Both sides at that handshake were lying. The Destructor wanted to use America's manpower to dig up his sun-killing machine. And the president wanted the Decepticons' technology just long enough to build something that could kill the Decepticons, and me, all in one afternoon. Me? My position was simple, and I said so out loud to the whole nervous lab. Let them dance. The Allspark is in my pocket. As long as I keep it, Galvatron can throw whatever party he likes. At the very worst, I take my cube and I leave this planet, and they can all keep their handshake. Steady, right? Reasonable. The kind of thing a man says when he thinks he's the one holding the only card that matters. Here's what I didn't clock. The president had noticed a hole in me. He'd watched the footage. Bullets stopping in the air, guns crumpling, an entire base turned to forest. All metal, all the metal in the world was mine to command, which meant every weapon his army owned was useless against me. So for 6 quiet months, while I taught Titan Grey to hold a blade, the president had factories running around the clock building guns that weren't made of metal, ceramics, composites, things a magnet can't touch. And he'd had his scientists dissect the Decepticons' space bridge tech until they could do the one thing that would truly ruin my day. Not seal space shut, that was too hard, but the opposite. Make space boil. Make it so unstable that even I wouldn't dare open a door through it, because the door might close on me halfway through and leave my top half in one county and the rest in another. He picked a spot on a map, a hill with a nice villa on it, where a certain angel liked to stay, and he decided to invite everyone to the same place at the same time, the Decepticons and me, and turn the whole hill into a crater with something he'd been building in secret, a weapon that could kill a Transformer in a single shot from 10 kilometers away, faster than the eye, faster than sound. The night it began, I was sitting cross-legged in the villa, meditating, feeling my strength tick upward 1 grain at a time, when the hair on the back of my neck stood up and my mind screamed danger before my ears heard a thing. I was on my feet before the first shell landed. "Everyone up," I shouted, and my voice came out with a lion's roar behind it, rolling through the whole house. "The Decepticons are here." Down in the garage, 4 sleeping Autobots opened their eyes at once. There's a special kind of funny in fighting for your life and realizing mid-swing that you've somehow become the villain of the movie. In the original, the Decepticons are the monsters and the Autobots team up with the humans to stop them, but I'd rearranged the furniture. So on that hill, in the dark, it was the Decepticons and the entire United States military standing shoulder to shoulder, and on the other side, the monster they'd all come to kill was me. Guns and shells came down like weather. If the Autobots had been made of anything softer than steel, they'd have been paste in the first 10 seconds. Titan Grey was magnificent. That's the part I need you to have before the rest of it. He waded into the Decepticons with his big battle blade and the swordsmanship I'd copied into him, and he was fast, and he was mean, and he was having the time of his short life. He took half of Cyclone's arm off with one cut. He talked the entire time. Back in my day, I chased guys 3 days and 3 nights with 2 watermelon knives. You little punks don't know who you're messing with. Cigarette pipe clamped in his teeth, cleaving a Decepticon in 2 while trash-talking the rest. For a machine that had been alive for 6 months, he fought like he'd been born for it, and 10 kilometers away, on a warship, someone lined up the weapon the president had built in secret and pointed it at the most dangerous thing on the field and pulled the trigger. 7 times the speed of sound, 10 kilometers in 4 seconds. No sound, no warning, nothing to dodge, because the thing arrives before the eye even reports that it left. Titan Grey had his sword raised for a finishing blow. A flash of light passed through the middle of him and left a hole you could see the sky through. He looked down at it, at the hole where his chest had been. Which, he said, treacherous little bastard, shoots a guy in the back. And he fell. I want to be honest with you because I've been light this whole time, joking my way across a war zone, and you deserve to know when I stopped. I stopped there. Something in me that I don't let out very often came all the way up, because he was mine, not a tool, not a mount, not free transportation. Mine, the loud, cowardly, ridiculous thing I'd built with my own hands and named after my pet and was going to take home so I wouldn't have to travel the worlds alone anymore, and somebody I couldn't even see had reached across 10 kilometers and switched him off like a lamp. The Autobots were shouting my name. Optimus was shouting, "Be careful, that weapon's too fast." I wasn't listening. I was already in the air, flying at the place the light had come from, and behind me, the fury went very, very quiet. They fired the thing at me next. I felt it more than saw it. The whole sky narrowing to a line pointed at my heart. Even with a thunder god's body, I knew, the way you know some things in your spine, that if that shot connected, I would not get up. So I didn't dodge. There wasn't time to dodge. I brought my sword across my chest and poured everything I had into a single word, block, and the shot hit the flat of the blade with the force of a small mountain, and I hung there in the air, teeth locked, arms screaming, and did not move. On the warship, 10 kilometers away, a room full of men who had just watched their god-killing weapon get caught bare-handed by a floating man made a sound I could feel from there. "Is that," someone whispered into the radio, "a human or a god?" Neither, I thought. Today, I'm neither. Today, I'm the thing you built this weapon to stop, and you just used your one good trick, and it didn't work, and now I'm going to come down there and show you what a bad trade you made. And I put my sword away, and I dropped toward the fleet. They'd built the non-metal guns for exactly this. As I came down on the fleet, a dozen shells came up to meet me, and I reached out to grab them the way I grab everything, and my hand closed on nothing. Ceramic, composite, not a scrap of metal in them. They punched through my defenses and into me, and for the first time on this plane, I bled. It was a good hit. I'll give the president that too. It rattled my insides and shredded my shirt and left me hanging over the water looking like a beggar, and then it made me angry, which was a mistake on a level I don't think they fully appreciated. I tore what was left of my shirt off and got to work. The sword split into 108 blades and swept their shells out of the air. A slash carrying every ounce of my will sheared their precious railgun in half. And then I lifted my hand over the flagship and gathered the wind and gave them the last technique of an entire ninja world. Rasen Shuriken went through the flagship lengthwise and opened into a tornado of a million tiny blades, and the flagship stopped being a ship and started being weather. I went through that fleet like a fox in a henhouse. Some of the warships got torn open and sank. Some got wrapped in trees and dragged under. Some just filled up with flying swords until they looked like something a very angry god had used for target practice. And that's the exact moment the sky opened up and rained gods on me. A dozen meteors came screaming down through the atmosphere, and every one of them stood up as a transformer, and at the front of them was the Fallen, millions of years old, and every one of those years in his eyes. He looked at the wreck I'd made of the fleet, and he looked at me, bleeding, and he said, almost kindly, "Such strength." And already injured, then Galvatron stepped forward and drove a strange rod into the ground, and space itself began to boil. I'd been counting on my escape hatch, you understand. That's my whole thing. When it gets bad, I open a door in the air and step to the other side of the world. But when I tried it now, the door came out wrong. Instead of a clean ring, it twisted and snarled, and jagged shards of raw space blinked in and out of the middle of it, and I understood in one cold second what the president's scientists had built. They couldn't lock space shut, so they'd done the opposite. They'd made it so easy to tear that tearing it would tear me. If I stepped through that door and it flickered, I'd come out the other side in pieces. A dozen giants closed a ring around me, and my only exit was a doorway that might cut me in half, and off in the distance the Autobots were losing. So I did the only thing left. I cheated. Again. I flooded the field with shadow clones, a screaming crowd of me, and while they hacked the clones down, I went invisible and started to slip out the side. The Destructor felt it, actually felt my invisible body moving, sensed it like a shark smells blood, and cut at the empty air where I was, and I had to block, which blew my cover. Thermal cameras swept the field. Radar pinged for a hidden man. A dozen monsters turned over rocks looking for me. and they didn't find me. For half an hour, they scanned every inch of that battlefield with every sense they had, and came up empty, and finally had to admit the impossible, that I had simply vanished. No space door, no invisibility, gone. Here's where I was. I was a rock, not hiding behind a rock. A rock. Transformation. Jutsu, the same 12-year-old's trick I'd used to grow angel wings, can turn you into an object, and I had turned myself into a large, boring, unremarkable stone and sat in the middle of the battlefield while a dozen ancient warriors stepped over me and around me and at one point, on me, hunting for a man who was, at that moment, geology. Galvatron flew a full circle overhead and found nothing. They left, certain I'd escaped, furious that they couldn't figure out how. I held the shape until the last of them was gone. Then the rock stood up and was a man again and looked around at what that half hour had cost. Because while they'd been hunting the rock, they'd been killing my friends. The Destructor had marked Optimus as the dangerous one and given the order, and by the time I dropped the disguise, Alpha Trion was dead on the ground and Hot Rod and the rest were in chains. I didn't rush out to save them. I want to be clear about that, because it's the coldest thing I did on this plane and I'd do it again. If I'd charged that field for them, I'd have died with them, and a dead man saves nobody, so I stayed a rock a little longer, and I watched them drag my friends away, and I did the sum in my head the way I always do, and the sum said, not yet. When the field was finally, truly empty, I walked out to two bodies, Titan Grey, with the hole through his chest, Alpha Trion, gone quiet. I gathered them both up into a pocket of folded space so the government couldn't have them for their laboratories, and my face, they tell me, went flat and still as water. They'd killed the loud one and the good one in the same hour, and somewhere in a White House, a man was pouring himself a drink and thinking he'd finally won. I had 6 weeks left on this plane. I decided to spend them teaching him otherwise. I didn't go loud. Loud was what they were braced for. I went quiet, which is so much worse. The Destructor had a mirror trick I liked, so I stole the idea and made it mine. A pocket world, a space folded off the side of the real one, where I could put a thing and no one outside would ever hear it scream. And one by one, I started putting Decepticons in there. It was almost polite. I'd catch one alone. They travel in a swarm now, terrified, but there's always one who wanders, and I'd kick it sideways through a mirror into the pocket world, where no one was coming to help, and I'd lay a hand on it and read its memory drive like a man flipping through a stranger's mail. I was hunting for something specific, the matrix of leadership, the key the fallen wanted, the thing that could bring my dead back. Most of them knew nothing, so most of them stayed in the mirror. In 3 days, half the Decepticons were simply gone. No bodies, no battle. Just fewer of them every morning, and a growing horror in the ranks, because the one thing worse than a monster is a monster you can't find. The Destructor handed out thermal cameras and forbade anyone to walk alone. It didn't help. When I couldn't be invisible, I wore the face of one of their own human soldiers and walked through the front door, and while I hunted the Decepticons for the key, I decided it was time to keep a promise. Because I told a man 1,000 miles away, months ago, with 2 bullets and a dead colonel between us, wait for me, I'm going to come to the White House personally and find you. And I am, whatever else you can say about me, a man who pays what he owes, in both directions. He'd made it hard. Give him credit. The White House had become a fortress. Hundreds of guards, a soldier every 3 steps, thermal imagers on every wall, the president sleeping in a nest of 300 armed men who stayed awake all night so he could close his eyes. He'd been having nightmares for weeks. Dozens of ways to die, over and over, every night. Sometimes I snapped his neck. Sometimes it was the trees. He'd wake up sweating and look at his guards and feel for a few minutes safe. I walked in as a piece of furniture. Transformation jutsu again. You can't shoot a lamp. I stood in the corner of his bedroom until he woke up on his own, some animal part of him sensing the extra person in the dark, and he sat up and saw a shape by the wall and 2 eyes in it, red, spinning slow. Who? He whispered. Who's there? What? I stepped into the moonlight so he could see my face. I told you half a year ago that I'd come back for you. You built all this. I gestured at the fortress around us. To keep me out. And you don't even remember I was the reason? His hand shot for the alarm. His hand did not arrive. My eyes had him. The illusion locked him in place. Couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but watch me cross the room. Relax, I said. I don't enjoy killing. I'm not going to kill you. I tapped the air, and the space beside his bed cracked like a dropped mirror. Humans are social creatures. Did you know that? You need each other. You go a little mad without company. I took him by the collar and lifted him toward the crack, toward the empty pocket world on the far side of it, the one with no people in it and no food and no way out. So I'm curious how long you last, all alone in there. Try not to do anything hasty. If you're still breathing when I leave this world, I'll make it quick. And I dropped the most powerful man on Earth into a room the size of forever, with no one in it, and closed the mirror behind him. In the morning, the guards knocked. Then they broke down the door. And then 300 elite soldiers stood in an empty bedroom, in a sealed fortress no fly could enter or leave, and had to explain to the world that the President of the United States had vanished from the middle of his own bed, and no one could tell them how. It went out on every station on Earth. Terrorists, they guessed. A kidnapping. The most protected man alive, gone like a magic trick. I didn't watch the coverage. I had a robot to find, because somewhere in the memories I'd been reading, one of them had finally coughed up the words I needed, matrix of leadership, and pointed me, of all places, toward Egypt. But before Egypt, I had a war to start. Somebody else's war, ideally, fought with somebody else's soldiers, over somebody else's grudge. While I watched from a comfortable distance. That's the good kind. The president had vanished, which left a hole at the top, and holes at the top make everyone nervous and stupid. So I put on the face of the Secretary of Defense, the plant desk man, still alive because I'd never actually had a reason to kill him, and I used his voice and his authority to announce to the entire American military that the Decepticons had taken the president. That was all it took. One accusation, from a face they trusted, and the honeymoon was over. The Decepticons, already jumpy from watching their friends disappear into thin air, tried to leave. Soldiers blocked them. Someone fired. And then the most powerful army on Earth and a dozen alien war gods went to war with each other, right there, over a lie I told in a borrowed voice, and I stood at the edge of it with my arms folded and watched my enemies pour their strength into killing each other. I'll be honest, it's a wonderful feeling, wiping out your enemies without lifting a finger. Tanks and jets and thousands of soldiers on one side, giants who could flatten a base on the other, and me in the middle in a disguise, nodding gravely, occasionally suggesting they hit each other harder. The Decepticons fell one by one. The humans died in the hundreds. It was a catastrophe for everyone present, which is to say it was going exactly to plan. It fell apart, as these things do, over a small human detail. Some deputy asked the Secretary of Defense, asked me, whether he should pick up the usual anniversary gift for the man's wife, and I said yes, thank you, that would be lovely, not knowing that in 20 years he had never once bought that man an anniversary gift. He drew his pistol on me in front of everyone. The face was perfect, he said, but the husband he'd worked beside for 2 decades would never have said yes to that, which is how I learned that the thing that undoes a perfect disguise is never the big stuff. It's always the small, warm, human stuff you'd have no way to know. Didn't matter. By then, I'd gotten everything I needed. The Decepticons were nearly gone. So I dropped the disguise, wrapped myself in armor no bullet could touch, and cut straight through the crossfire to the last 2 standing, the Fallen and Galvatron. I offered them a door, a teleport, out of the death trap, a way to live. They knew it was a trap of mine. They took it anyway, because the alternative was dying on that field in the next 30 seconds, and a trap you might survive beats a certainty you won't. They came through into a place of my choosing, wounded and cornered, and I took the Fallen's arms off with the sword, and I wrapped Galvatron in living wood, and then I sat down across from a creature tens of millions of years old to have a conversation. Where, I said, did you learn about the matrix of leadership? He laughed at me, told me he knew he was going to die, and a dying man has no reason to help his killer, and I could do whatever I liked, he'd tell me nothing. You misunderstand, I said. I'm not asking your permission. And I put my hand on him. I have a technique I rarely use, a mind thing I copied off the worst creature in a ninja world, a way to reach into another soul and take the wheel. It leaves the person fully awake for it, which is the cruelty of it. They feel their own hands move without them, and I made the Fallen, the oldest thing on that plane, the mastermind of the whole doomed scheme, sit there and personally, carefully, against his own screaming will, decode the map hidden in the Allspark, and read me the location of the treasure he'd crossed the stars to find. Egypt. An old temple, in the sand. Thank you, I said when I had it, for your cooperation. He called me a devil, over and over, his eyes full of a very old terror, and I think for the first time in tens of millions of years, the Fallen understood that he had finally met something he should have run from. Then I put every ounce of will into the sword, and the creature that had outlived civilizations came apart in the light and was quiet. I kept Galvatron alive though, wrapped in wood, sealed in the mirror. I had a use for him yet. He had something inside him I wanted, and I don't waste good parts. And then I went to Egypt to dig up the thing that could give me back my dead. The temple was empty. Just sand and a single old mural on a far wall, and that specific silence old places have. I sprang the Autobots I'd rescued from the government's freezer, Hot Rod, Perceptor, Grimlock, Thawed and Alive, and we stood in the emptiness and I felt around with my mind until I found the lie in it. The wall was hollow. There was a room behind the room. I cut a doorway through the mural, and inside were the dead. A hall of rusted Cybertronian bodies, ancient beyond counting, and among them a small strange object that hummed against my mind the moment I looked at it, the matrix of leadership. I closed my hand around it and poured my thoughts in, and the thing answered, because there were souls still folded inside it, the worn thin remnants of the old leaders who'd chosen to die rather than let the sun-killing machine ever run. They knew who I was. They knew I'd killed the Fallen, that Optimus was dead, that the All-Spark rode in my pocket. And when I told them what I wanted, they gave their blessing and faded like a held breath, finally let go. Here's the part I didn't advertise. That little object was two things at once. It was a resurrection. And it was the key, the actual literal key, to the machine that switches off suns. Hold it, and you hold the power to end a star and drink what falls out. Kill gods. Kill Buddhas. The kind of power that ends the conversation about who is strongest, forever, in every world. I thought about that. I want you to know I thought about it, standing in that tomb with the key in my hand, because I'm not a saint and I've never pretended to be one. A weapon like that doesn't come around twice. Then I went and stood over Titan Grey's body, and I used the key on him first. The light spread out of the matrix and the all sparked together, and the hole the railgun had punched through my friend's chest closed up out of nothing, steel knitting like skin, and then his optics flickered on, and the first words out of him, before he'd even fully sat up, were, "Hey boss, I'm not dead. Ha, told you, lucky guy." He looked down at his own healed chest and grinned around the pipe, and the very next thing he wanted to know was whether I'd found the coward who shot him in the back so he could go collect. When I told him the coward was already handled and that I'd torn the world apart to bring him back, he didn't get sentimental about it. He decided out loud that his new life philosophy was, and I quote, "As long as I don't die being reckless, I'm gonna be reckless as hell." Which is the most Titan Grey sentence ever assembled. I'd have been disappointed by anything else. And then I walked to Alpha Trion, and I did the thing I'd been quietly deciding not to think too hard about. I pushed the key into his heart. Because here's the math that isn't math. Keep the Matrix, and I become the single most powerful thing across every world I'll ever visit. Give it up, and I get back one dead red truck who spent 6 months building me a friend and asked for nothing, and who died because standing next to me got him marked. And I looked at those two options, godhood or paying a debt, and it wasn't actually close. Not for me. I can be the coldest thing you've ever met to a stranger or an enemy, but I do not let a debt of gratitude sit. It's the one kind of debt you can never fully pay off, and the only thing worse than owing it is pretending you don't. The Matrix sank into Optimus's chest and vanished, and his eyes came on, and the first thing the leader of the Autobots did, upon returning from death, was touch the spot over his heart and look at me like he was seeing me for the first time. He knew what I'd given up. He said something about how he'd heard humans could go to great lengths for a friend, and always thought it was an exaggeration. Don't, I told him. Call me a good person. Where I'm from, that's an insult. And I meant it. I'm not good. I'm just even. You do me a wrong, I'll walk across a plane to repay it in full. You do me a kindness, same walk, same interest. The ledger balances, or I don't sleep. He tried to keep the second secret, that the Matrix was also the Sun Killer's key, that I'd handed away a doomsday to buy a friend. I told him I already knew. That's what finally got him, I think. Not that I'd given it up by accident. That I'd known exactly what it was worth, and given it up anyway. The Autobots had somewhere to be after that. The stars, the long dark, a home world to go rebuild. There was nothing left for them on an Earth that had put a bounty on all our heads. So they said their goodbyes, and Alpha Trion rolled out toward the sea and the sky, and I watched a good man drive off to go be a good man somewhere I'd never see. That left me two loose ends, Galvatron, still wrapped in wood in the mirror, and a certain president, still alone in the dark. I had unfinished business with both, Galvatron first. And this is the part where being a walking hard drive pays off in a way that would keep his kind up at night if his kind slept. See, I couldn't copy a Transformer's genes into myself. Silicon into meat doesn't take. But Titan Grey was silicon, and I can plug into two drives at once and shuffle files between them. So I put one hand on the wood-wrapped Galvatron and one hand on Titan Grey, and I copied 30 gigabytes of Galvatron's genetic code straight across, from the leader of the Decepticons into my chain-smoking little brother. Titan Grey shivered, blinked, and said, boss, I think I got a new mode. And he stood up and folded himself into a shape he'd never worn before. A spaceship. Galvatron's spaceship. My getaway truck could fly now, because I'd photocopied it out of the corpse of a war god. Galvatron, still conscious in the wood, watched the thing he was get worn by someone else, and the horror on that steel face was its own small reward. He'd spent this whole plane certain there was a floor to my abilities, a bottom he'd eventually find. There wasn't. There never is. I let him understand that, fully, and then, since I had what I wanted and Galvatron had run out of parts I needed, I finished him. Then I went to the mirror where I'd left a president. 10 days he'd had in there. Alone, in a room with no walls and no people and no food, exactly the way I'd left him. I don't know if it was hunger that took him, or if he did it himself, and I find I don't especially care to know. He was a body when I opened the mirror, which means I never technically broke my rule. I did say I didn't enjoy killing, and I didn't kill him, I just declined to feed him. You can decide for yourself whether that's a meaningful distinction. He couldn't anymore, and that was the plain, start to finish. I'd fallen out of the sky into a war zone with nothing, a stranger with a blank palm and half a year to kill. And I was leaving with the single most powerful object in the universe in my pocket, a flying robot for a friend, a president dead in a pocket dimension, an entire alien civil war fought and won mostly by getting other people to swing first, and a resurrection key spent, freely, on a red truck who'd have done the same for me. A whole superpower had put a nationwide warrant out for a man they'd never once managed to touch, and that man was, at that exact moment, already gone, because the pattern on my palm had filled in. The 6 months were up. And whether I was ready or not, I was not, I never am. The sky opened its mouth and the wind came for me. I grabbed Titan Grey on the way through, the way you grab the one thing in a burning house you actually care about, and the Transformers plane folded up behind me and was gone, and I fell through the space between worlds toward home. Home. Let me remind you what home is because I'd almost let myself forget, playing angel and toppling governments. Home is worse. The wind spat me out near a mountain base in a world that had ended. That's home. While I'd been playing angel in a country of skyscrapers, back here the dead still outnumbered the living about 100 to 1, and the first thing that happened when I landed was that 2 zombie bulls charged me out of the tree line. I flicked 2 fingers, 2 threads of swordlight crossed the clearing, and the bulls came apart before they'd finished their first bellow. Below level 3, the dead aren't a threat to me anymore. They're paperwork. Titan Grey rolled out of the wormhole behind me and took one look at the carcasses. "Boss," he said, in the voice of a machine reconsidering its life choices, "your home is way scarier than the robot planet." "You get used to it," I told him. I did not tell him you never get used to it. Some things you don't say out loud. He carried me back to the base as a truck, showing off the whole way that he could fly now if he wanted, that I'd made him something no other machine in 2 worlds could be, and I walked in the gate as the leader of the place, which still felt like a coat that didn't fit. My people gaped at the truck that stood up into a giant robot. Somebody said, "Transformers," in a small voice. I let them stare. And then a small figure came out of the crowd and stopped in front of me, and my chest did something complicated. Her name is Ling Shu. She looks like a little girl of 12 or 13. She is technically a zombie, but a zombie who thinks, who talks, who chooses, who looked me over head to toe to make sure I hadn't come back with any new holes in me before she'd let herself smile. I'd found her in a ruined building half a year ago and never once been able to make myself leave her behind. I put a hand on her head. She squinted, pleased, the way a cat does. "Brother Zhongjing," she said, "you're back." "I'm back," I said. And for exactly that long, standing in the wreck of the world with my hand on the head of a girl the world would call a monster, I wasn't running a con or winning a war or balancing a ledger. I was just a man who'd come home to someone who'd waited. It doesn't happen often. I try to notice it when it does. I had plans for this place. Big ones. There's a mineral out in the swamps, Moonscar Crystal, the last piece I needed to build a gate, a real permanent door between the worlds, so that one day I wouldn't have to wait on the wind and the pattern on my palm. I'd cut a deal with a bigger base over the crystal, played the greedy card, settled for a fifth of the take, and walked away, calling it a win. All of that was moving. All of that was the long game. But the long game and I had an old problem, and its name was the pattern on my palm. Because I'd been home barely long enough to matter, a handful of days, a deal signed, a girl's hair patted, when I climbed into Titan Grey to escort a work crew out to the mine, and the sky did the thing the sky does, and the wound in the air opened up right on schedule. "Oh, come on," I said. "I just got here." The wind did not care that I just gotten here. The wind never does. It took me, and it took the truck I was sitting in, and it pulled us both out of the apocalypse and threw us at the next world before I'd even finished the sentence. I came out the other side in the middle of a city street at night in a very ordinary-looking car, in a country I recognized and a decade I didn't. Japan. The 90s. The real 90s. Phones with buttons. A whole city with the hum of an old arcade about it. I could feel the tech had stalled out a couple decades back, and I could read the signs, and there was a newspaper in the hotel with a girl's face on the front and a word under it. Concert, a singer, Mai Shiranui. That name knocked something loose in the back of my skull, and all at once I knew where I was, which meant I knew what these people could do. And I wanted, before I did anything else, to test the ceiling of this new world, to find out how hard the strong ones hit, so I'd know how careful to be. The universe, kind as ever, handed me a test subject in a dark alley. He was sitting alone against the wall, a tall man with hair the color of dried blood, and at his feet a scrawny stray kitten was lapping milk out of a bottle cap he'd set down for it. The scene was, genuinely, tender. This murderous-looking stranger, patiently feeding a stray cat in the dark. I checked the number on him out of habit and it came back high, near the top of what this world had to offer. So, being me, I walked over and interrupted the nicest thing happening in that city. He turned his head. His eyes on the cat had been almost gentle. On me, they were winter. Roll, he said. One word. And if I'd rather not? The kitten's fur stood straight up and it bolted into the trash because even a stray cat knew what was coming before I did. The man stood. Then die. He came at me like a dropped knife. Fast, nearly as fast as I am, and I am not slow, and every strike landed clean, perfect force, perfect angle, claws like tempered steel, one flawless technique flowing into the next with no seam to catch. I had the red eyes open and my whole body in the fight, and I was still giving ground, step by step, which almost never happens to me anymore. In a pure hand-to-hand brawl, this man was a nightmare with good manners. Then he lit a purple fire in his palm, a flame that felt less like heat and more like an ending, and I stopped enjoying myself. I answered it with the wind, compressed a Rasen shuriken in my hand, and we threw our best techniques into the same 3 feet of air. The alley became a storm of purple fire and screaming wind. When it cleared, we were both standing, both ragged, both bleeding, and neither of us 1 inch closer to winning. He wound up to do it again, and I put my hands up. Look, there's no bad blood between us. I'm not the guy you're actually angry at. Do we really need to do this to the death? He didn't answer that. He just fixed me with those winter eyes and said, "Consider yourself lucky to be alive today," which is a hell of a thing to say about a fight you didn't win, and turned to leave with his coat back to me, a crescent moon stitched between his shoulders. Wait, I said. He paused. What year is it? He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. This man who just fought me to a draw was now visibly recalculating whether he'd tied with an idiot. It's 1995, he said flatly, and walked off into the dark, and I let him, because I'd gotten what I came for. I knew the ceiling now, I knew the year, and I knew his name, because everyone who's ever touched this world knows his name. Ryu Hoshi, the coolest, angriest, most complicated man in the whole story. I'd remember, later, that I met him coming out of a concert, feeding a cat. I'd think it was a coincidence. It wasn't. But I'm getting ahead of the part that actually matters, which is that a few days later, I went to meet the hero of this world, and he told me a piece of news that turned Ryu Hoshi from a cool stranger into the single strangest mystery I'd run into in 5 years of worlds. On the way to meet the hero of this world, I got rear-ended by a drunk playboy with hair like a lightning bolt and an attitude to match, and because he threw money at me and sneered, I lit my own hand up with a thunder god's lightning and put him on the ground twitching. His name was Terry, and he was one of the hero's teammates, and I told him to go home and tell his boss that a man named Zhang Jing was coming. It's good to be announced. The hero was Ken Masters, 17, maybe 18, a fire in his hands that his family had carried for 1,000 years, and the easy confidence of a kid who'd never lost. We sparred, his crimson fire against my wind, and fought, of course, to a draw, because this world was full of people who could stand toe-to-toe with me, and I was starting to like it here, but Ken wasn't in the mood to celebrate a good match. Because the night before, someone had walked into his family's home and taken his father. Ken Guken, a master, a man with the same 1,000-year fire, gone, with signs of a fight and no body, and Ken, grasping at anything, had started to wonder if the strange man who'd beaten his teammate and shown up out of nowhere might have had something to do with it. I gave him 2 names to chase instead. One was a warlord I remembered from the story who was supposed to be dead. The other was Ryu Hoshi, and that's where it got strange, because Ken had never heard the name Ryu Hoshi in his life. I'll say that again, because it stopped me cold too. In every version of this story I'd ever known, these two were destined enemies, fire against fire, the oldest feud in the whole world. And the hero was looking at me blank, so he had his people dig up everything on the Hoshi family, and a few days later he handed me a file, and I read it, and I felt the floor tilt. Because the Ryu Hoshi in that file was not a monster. He was a gentle boy, a quiet, bullied, soft-spoken kid who hated violence, who'd never trained a day in his life, who got pushed around at school and never pushed back. His one gift wasn't fighting, it was music. The boy was a piano prodigy, good enough that his songs had ended up in other people's concerts, good enough that if his stern father hadn't forbidden it, he might have grown up to be a star. And then, about a year ago, his father lost a fight, died a few days later, and the gentle boy vanished. And when he came back, he was the winter-eyed nightmare who'd fought me to a standstill in an alley. Read that again. A soft, frightened kid who'd never thrown a punch became, in one single year, strong enough to draw even with a man who'd spent 5 years eating the powers of a dozen worlds. That's not training. You don't get there in a year. You don't get there in 10. I know exactly how long it takes because it took me 5, and I had a cheat code written into my blood. So what got into Ryu Hoshi? What crawled into that gentle, musical, bullied boy and hollowed him out and left this behind? I didn't know. For the first time in a long time, standing in that world, I genuinely did not know the answer. And I have made a career out of knowing the answers before anyone else in the room. It gnawed at me. It still does. Here's the part that makes it a real problem though, because a few days after that, an invitation found me, a tournament, the King of Fighters, run by that warlord who was supposed to be dead, with something older and colder standing in the shadows behind him. Every great fighter on Earth was being gathered into one arena, and to enter, you need a team of 3. And Ryu Hoshi, the mystery in human skin, the boy who became a monster and doesn't know how any more than I do, came looking for me. Not to finish our fight, to stand beside me, because he needed a partner strong enough to matter, and in all the world, I was the one he'd found. So let me tell you where I stood at the end of all this. 6 months ago, I'd fallen out of the sky into a strange world with a blank palm and empty hands, a nobody, a rumor, and now, I'd toppled the government of the most powerful nation on one Earth and walked away clean. I had a universe's worth of power sleeping in my pocket. I had a chain-smoking robot who called me boss and could fly, and I was about to walk into an arena at the side of the most dangerous, unsolved question I'd ever met, to fight for reasons that ran deeper and darker than a stolen father, with something ancient pulling the strings from the dark. The tournament was about to begin. My teammate was a monster who used to be a gentle boy. And somewhere behind the curtain, the thing that had made him was waiting to see who walked out of that arena alive. What turned Ryu Hoshi into a weapon? Ask me again after the King of Fighters. I have a feeling I'm about to find out the hard way.